Having to work with an arrogant person in the morning was making my job difficult. Every day, my coworkers and I put up with the abusive behavior of our supervisor, an elite manager who had graduated from a prestigious university. One day, I reached my limit and decided to confront her. She sneered, "You should talk to your bosses or something. I'm one of the elites, nobody's going to listen to a dropout like you." She seemed so sure of herself, but one word from the company president, who happened to be passing by, completely changed her attitude. "My name is Daniel Smith. I started working as a salesperson for a subsidiary of a big company right after high school. My father had been hurt in a motorcycle accident and couldn't work anymore, so I got this job to support my family. I was able to get the job thanks to my father's connections with the company. The people here got along well, and I enjoyed my work. My boss was nice, and my coworkers were easy to get along with, so I didn't usually have much to worry about. But today, I felt a little down." "Hey, Smith, isn't today the meeting with the head office?" my colleague asked. "Yes, it is," I replied. "That means she's coming here, right? I wish I could have taken the day off," he said. "Don't worry about it," I replied. "You don't have to deal with her directly." But honestly, I was feeling down, too. Just then, we heard her voice. Why weren't any employees waiting at the entrance for me? They knew I was coming, and this is how they react? She demanded angrily. My coworker muttered something and quickly left, avoiding her. The woman giving orders was Manager Jones. She regularly visited from the headquarters for meetings. She had graduated from a prestigious university and was hired directly into management, but she was arrogant and always looked down on us employees from the subsidiary. "Typical, uneducated and incompetent as usual," she said, clearly annoyed. "You all make me look bad. Let's start this meeting quickly. I don't want to spend any more time with you people than I have to." I apologized politely. "Sorry, ma'am, but we're still waiting for one more person who's on the way." "You're going to make me wait?" she snapped. "I came all the way here from headquarters, and you people aren't even ready?" "You arrived 20 minutes early, ma'am," I said, though I tried to keep my tone respectful, but I was frustrated. She was always so unreasonable, and yet, because she was elite, we felt we couldn't stand up to her. We all talked about her behavior among ourselves at the subsidiary, but in the end, we always endured it without saying anything to her. Then, one morning, as I was driving to work, I prepared myself to face another difficult day. I noticed an elderly woman crouched in distress in the middle of the road. It was clearly an emergency, but most people around just pretended not to see her. Not wanting to get involved, I rushed over and asked, "Are you okay, ma'am?" But she didn't respond. Her breathing was labored, and she couldn't speak clearly. I quickly took out my phone and called 911. When the ambulance arrived, I went with her to the hospital. A nurse soon told me, "It's okay for you to go home. We'll take care of her until her family arrives." I had already informed my company that I'd be late, and I wanted to make sure she was okay, so I stayed until her family arrived. Thankfully, she wasn't in any serious danger and was able to leave the hospital a few days later. A few weeks later, I unexpectedly received a transfer order to the headquarters branch. It was a direct order from the company president. I wasn't sure if I should go, but my coworker said, "This shows they noticed your hard work. Go and do your best." Their encouragement helped me decide to accept the transfer. My first day at headquarters was busy. I wanted to introduce myself to each department. On my way, I saw the chief in the hallway and hurried to greet her, but she looked at me with disgust. "What are you doing here?" she said. "Aren't you a little out of place?" "Good morning, Chief. I've been assigned here," I replied. "Oh, you're being relocated here? What are they thinking?" She ignored my greeting and went on. "Having to breathe the same air as an uneducated idiot like you in the morning is going to ruin my whole day." I tried to stay polite. "Chief, I'm sorry if I made you feel that way." "Oh, stop talking. Stay out of my way. I'm busy." She waved me off like I was an annoying fly, clearly not interested in listening. Realizing it was pointless to keep trying, I gave up and returned to work. When I returned to the floor where the chief worked, I overheard her angrily scolding one of her employees. "You're incompetent. Why can't you handle something as simple as this? Even a new hire could do this," she snapped. "I'm sorry," the employee mumbled, clearly upset about the mistake he'd made. He clenched his fists, bowed his head, and took the harsh words in silence. "If this is the best you can do, I'd rather have someone else working for me. You're useless to me now. Clean out your desk and get out of my way," she continued, before finally noticing me. Our eyes met, and her face twisted with anger. What are you doing back here? Didn't I tell you to stay out of my way this morning? She demanded. Please, calm down, Chief. I actually need to talk to you today, I said, trying to keep things respectful. Stop talking. I don't have time for incompetent people like you. She stormed off, slamming the door behind her. After she left, I approached the employee who had just been yelled at. He flinched at the sound of the door slamming. Is that typical of the chief? I asked. It happens every day, he replied with frustration. She constantly disrespects me. Careful, keep your voice down, or she'll hear you, I said, worried she might come back and give him an even harder time. I did my best to calm him down. I've been putting up with this for a long time, but I can't take it anymore, the employee said, stumbling to his desk. He pulled out a white envelope from a drawer. Is that a resignation letter? I asked. Yes, he replied. I've been thinking about this for a while. My previous job was peaceful and fulfilling, but ever since the chief arrived, this place has become unbearable. He looked sadly at his desk, covered in notes and documents. It was clear he had once loved his job and worked hard. I understand how you feel, I told him, but doesn't it bother you to see all your hard work wasted because of one difficult manager? Of course it does, he sighed. I've worked hard here and been here longer than she has, but it's just... I could see his frustration and sadness. He was struggling, with nowhere for his emotions to go. The chief might think that way, but there are people here who trust and rely on you. Why don't you stay a little longer, for them? Stay a little longer? He asked, surprised. Don't worry, I'll take care of this. It's not you who should have to quit. Leaving him in surprise, I went to find the chief. I couldn't stand by while more employees were mistreated. I quickly tracked her down in the break room, where she was drinking tea. Excuse me, I said. She looked annoyed as she noticed me. Why are you still here? You're as persistent as a fly. I'm on a break, leave me alone. The chief looked tired, probably from all the yelling. I took a deep breath and said, Chief, I'm going to conduct a formal investigation into your treatment of the employees here. If necessary, there will be consequences. She looked shocked. What are you talking about? Are you trying to play hero and defend those incompetents? No, I'm not, I replied calmly. Fine, go tell your bosses. Then, I'm an elite, with the support of my superiors. Nobody's going to listen to a dropout like you from the subsidiary, she sneered. Just then, a man appeared from the other side of the room. Smith, how are things going for you? It was the president. I'm doing my best, thanks to you, sir, I replied. The chief immediately changed her tone. Hello, President, what a pleasant surprise. The president smiled. I'm glad to hear things are going well. Have you met the new branch manager? What, new branch manager? The chief asked, looking completely confused. The president looked at the chief with surprise. He's standing right in front of you. Haven't you been briefed? The chief laughed, assuming he was joking. This employee from a subsidiary? You must be kidding, boss. But the president's expression turned serious. I'm not joking. He is now the branch manager of this office. Don't be disrespectful by calling him incompetent. The chief's face turned pale, and she looked as if she might faint. I looked at her calmly. I tried to tell you earlier, but you ignored me. I've already informed the other departments. She muttered in shock, unable to believe it. An uneducated, incompetent. The president sighed, clearly disappointed in her. He began to explain. Let me tell you a little about this incompetent you've been mistreating. He turned to the chief. This branch manager's father founded this business. However, after his father was injured in a car accident, I stepped in to help run things. The chief was speechless. He's the former president's son? Yes, the president confirmed. I've been asking him to come to headquarters for a while, but he's always preferred his role at the subsidiary. The chief, completely rattled, asked, Then, why did you suddenly come here now? She'd momentarily forgotten she was speaking in front of the president. He looked shocked to see this side of her, as she usually acted respectfully around him. The president continued, I strongly urged him to transfer here. He's my mother's lifesaver. Your mother? The chief stammered. Yes, a few weeks ago, when an elderly woman was struggling in the middle of the road, he was the only one who stopped to help her. He called an ambulance and stayed with her until the family arrived, even though everyone else just walked by. The chief's mouth dropped open in disbelief. The president nodded. I didn't want him to stay buried in a subsidiary when he deserves so much more. That's why I made him the branch manager here. The chief, finally understanding the situation, looked completely defeated. On the day I was appointed branch manager, I had doubts about whether I was ready for the role. I had only worked at a subsidiary, and suddenly, I was being asked to lead a branch of the main office. But after hearing from the president and receiving my father's call asking me to support the company he had helped build, I made up my mind to accept. The president explained to the chief, "Smith is now branch manager, so show him respect and pay close attention to what he says." Then, he left the room. I turned to the chief and said, "You've been mistreating not just the employees from subsidiaries, but also your direct subordinates. I know what it's like to be looked down on because of my education level. Now that I'm branch manager, I can't overlook this anymore. Be prepared for the consequences." The chief sank to the floor and began to cry, her pride severely wounded. She had always looked down on me, only to find herself in a lower position. My difficult days were over. The next day, we began an investigation into the chief's behavior. After interviewing various employees, many reported the harsh comments and actions she had directed at them. Due to her misconduct, the chief was disciplined and left the company without a word. Her high self-esteem had taken a big hit. With her position now vacant, the president promoted the employee she had once yelled at to be the new chief. He had been with the company for many years, was dedicated to his work, and understood firsthand what it was like to be treated unfairly. I felt confident he would make a great leader who respected his team. As for me, I aimed to lead by listening to employees. I held regular meetings to hear their opinions, organized training for those in higher positions to help them become better leaders, and tried to stay connected with everyone, just as I had at the subsidiary. Thanks to these efforts, the company's atmosphere improved, and it became a much better place to work, reminding me of the warm, collaborative environment I had enjoyed at the subsidiary. "Smith, I'm sorry about what happened with Jones, but thanks to you, the company is doing very well," the president said. Sometime later, he invited me to his office for coffee to discuss the company's progress. "I'm getting older," he said thoughtfully. "Eventually, I'd like you to succeed me as president." "With all respect, Mr. President, I don't see myself becoming president," I replied. He looked surprised. "Why, your father would have wanted this too." "I want to work alongside the employees, supporting the company and being close to the customers. It'd be hard to do that if I were president." The president looked at me for a moment, then laughed. "You're a unique one, Smith. Most people would jump at this offer." "Maybe I'm a bit unusual," I admitted. "No, it's good," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "That's exactly the kind of person we need here." Then he added, "You have a meeting coming up, right? Go on, keep up the good work."
The house was perfect. After months of renovations, choosing paint colors, hunting for furniture, and agonizing over every tiny detail, it finally felt like a home. Our home. I'd spent countless hours on this space, pouring in not just money but heart and soul. It wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of what I thought my marriage to Daniel could be. A partnership. A place where we could start fresh and build something beautiful together. That's why, when he casually dropped the bomb over dinner, it felt like a slap in the face. "So, Greg's going to stay with us for a while," he said, spearing a piece of chicken with his fork. "You know, just until he gets back on his feet." I blinked at him, not sure I'd heard him right. "Greg? Your friend? The one going through the divorce?" "Yeah," Daniel said, chewing like it was no big deal. "He needs a place to crash, and he's bringing his dog too." I put my fork down, my appetite evaporating. "How long is a while?" He shrugged. "Until further notice." My name is Julia, and I'm 36 years old. For the past year, I've been pouring my energy into this house. It wasn't just about renovations. It was about creating a sanctuary, a place where Daniel and I could finally settle down and start the next chapter of our lives. But over the years, I'd started to notice a troubling pattern. Daniel had a habit of making decisions, big ones, without consulting me. Whether it was switching jobs, planning vacations, or apparently, inviting his recently divorced best friend to live with us indefinitely, my opinion was always an afterthought. He'd brush off my concerns with a casual, "It's fine," or "We'll figure it out." And each time I'd let it go, convincing myself it wasn't worth the fight. This time, though, it felt different. The house was supposed to be our space, the one place where I thought I'd finally have a say. And yet, here we were, with Daniel unilaterally deciding to upend our lives. Again. "Daniel," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "don't you think we should have talked about this first? This is a huge decision." He looked at me like I'd just suggested something ridiculous. "Why? It's my house too. I don't need your permission to help my best friend." I felt my stomach knot. This isn't just about Greg. We've just finished moving in, we're finally settling down, and now you're inviting someone else to live with us indefinitely? What about his dog? What about our space? This affects both of us. Daniel sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Look, it's not a big deal. Greg's going through a rough time and I'm not going to abandon him. He's my best friend. You'd do the same if it were one of your friends." "That's not the point," I said, my voice sharper now. "The point is, you didn't ask me. You just decided, and now I'm supposed to go along with it like I don't have a choice?" "It's my house too, Julia," he snapped, his tone turning defensive. "And my decision is final." The words hung in the air like a punch to the gut. My decision is final. Not our decision. My decision. In that moment, it was painfully clear. He didn't see me as an equal partner. He saw me as someone who'd adjust, compromise, and bend to whatever he wanted. And the worst part? He expected me to accept it without a fight. I stared at him across the table, my heart pounding. Every fiber of my being wanted to explode, to yell, to tell him exactly how wrong he was. But instead, I forced myself to take a deep breath. If there was one thing I'd learned over the years, it was that arguing with Daniel rarely led to anything productive. He'd dig in his heels, double down, and turn the blame back on me. So I did something I hadn't done before. I stayed quiet. "Okay," I said finally, my voice calm but icy. "If that's how you feel." Daniel frowned, clearly expecting more of a reaction. "That's it?" I nodded. "That's it." I cleared the table without another word, retreating to the bedroom as Daniel sat back down and turned on the TV. My hands shook as I loaded the dishwasher, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He thought he'd won. He thought I'd let this go, just like I always did. But this time, he was wrong. That night, as Daniel slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house I'd spent months building didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a stage for someone else's decisions, someone else's rules. And if I didn't take a stand now, it would only get worse. A plan began to form in the back of my mind, small at first, but growing with every passing moment. I wasn't going to yell or beg or try to change his mind. I was going to show him what it meant to make a decision without considering someone else. When he arrived with Greg and that dog, they'd find out just how final my decisions could be. I spent the next few days quietly setting my plan in motion. Daniel didn't suspect a thing. Why would he? He'd made it clear he thought his word was law, and as usual, he assumed I'd fall in line. But this time, I wasn't backing down. I'd spent too much time, effort, and energy creating this home to let it become someone else's crash pad. No questions asked. The first step was the locks. I called a locksmith while Daniel was at work, explaining that I wanted all the exterior locks replaced. "It's a precaution," I told the man, forcing a polite smile as he drilled away. He didn't need to know the details, and frankly, I wasn't ready to admit to anyone what had pushed me to this point. When the job was done, I held the new keys in my hand, feeling a flicker of power I hadn't felt in months. Step 2 was reclaiming the space inside. I walked through the house, taking stock of everything that screamed Daniel's decisions. The oversized recliner he insisted on keeping, the ugly coffee table his mother gave us, the ridiculous sports memorabilia cluttering the walls. I moved it all into the garage. By the time I was done, the house looked different. Lighter. Mine. Lauren came over that evening to help finalize the details of my counterplan. She'd been my best friend since college, the one person who always told me the truth, even when it was hard to hear. "You're really going through with this?" she asked, lounging on the freshly cleared couch. "Absolutely," I said, pouring 2 glasses of wine. "He wants to make unilateral decisions? Fine. Let's see how he likes it when I do the same." Lauren grinned, raising her glass. "I love this for you. But seriously, what's your endgame? What happens when he shows up with Greg and the dog?" I took a sip of wine, savoring the moment. "I'll let them know that this is still my house too. They can either respect my boundaries or they can figure out another plan. I'm done bending over backward for Daniel's nonsense." The next step was preparing for their arrival. I had no intention of turning Greg away outright. I knew it wasn't his fault that Daniel had overstepped. But I wasn't going to roll out the welcome mat either. I set up the guest room with the bare minimum: a mattress, a single pillow, and an old blanket. No extra comforts, no space for the dog, nothing that screamed "make yourself at home." If Daniel wanted to play the generous host, he could do it without my help. Meanwhile, I packed a small bag of Daniel's things, just the essentials, and left it by the front door. It wasn't a threat, exactly. It was a reminder that this was my home too, and I wouldn't hesitate to protect it if he continued to ignore my voice. The real pièce de résistance was the letter. I spent hours drafting it, making sure every word hit exactly the way I wanted. It wasn't an angry rant. That wasn't my style. It was calm, clear, and firm, laying out exactly how I felt and what I expected moving forward. "Daniel," it read, "this house is our shared home, which means decisions about it should be made together. By inviting Greg to live here without consulting me, you dismissed my feelings and undermined our partnership. I won't tolerate being treated as an afterthought in my own home. If Greg stays here, it will be under my conditions, not yours. And if you can't respect that, you're free to leave." I printed the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and taped it to the front door. It was the first thing Daniel and Greg would see when they arrived. The days leading up to their arrival were oddly quiet. Daniel mentioned Greg a few times, casually referring to the arrangements he'd made, but he didn't press me for input. That suited me just fine. I kept my answers short and polite, hiding my growing anticipation behind a calm facade. Lauren checked in every day, equal parts amused and excited. "I wish I could see their faces when they read that letter," she said during one of our phone calls. "Do you think Daniel will even understand what he did wrong?" I sighed, running my fingers over the new keys in my pocket. "Honestly, probably not. But that's not the point. This isn't about him getting it. It's about me standing up for myself." Finally, the day arrived. Daniel had texted me earlier that morning to let me know they'd be at the house around 6 p.m. "Make sure everything's ready for Greg," he wrote, as though I were some kind of hotel concierge. I rolled my eyes and set about putting the finishing touches on my plan. The house was spotless, the guest room perfectly mediocre, and the letter taped firmly to the door. I felt a mix of nerves and anticipation as the clock ticked closer to 6. For years, I'd let Daniel's behavior slide, convincing myself that it wasn't worth the fight. But this time, I was ready. When I heard the car pull into the driveway, my heart pounded in my chest. I stood near the kitchen, out of sight but close enough to hear everything. I didn't need to see their faces to know the moment they read the letter. Daniel's voice carried loud and clear. "What the hell is this?" he barked, his tone a mix of confusion and anger. "Looks like a letter," Greg said, his voice quieter. "Maybe you should read it." I held my breath as silence fell over the house, the weight of my words sinking in. What the hell is this supposed to mean? Daniel's voice roared through the house as the front door slammed shut. I stayed in the kitchen, letting the words linger in the air. I wanted him to read the letter fully, to stew in the implications before I made my entrance. "What's going on?" Greg's voice followed, quieter but tinged with awkward concern. "Should I leave? I don't want to cause problems." "Oh, you're not leaving," Daniel said angrily, his voice rising. "This is my house too, and nobody gets to make rules without me." I walked out of the kitchen then, calm and collected, as though I'd just finished reading a book. "Oh, hi, Daniel, Greg." My tone was so casual, it threw both of them off for a moment. "I see you found the letter." Daniel turned to me, the crumpled paper still in his hand. "What is this?" he demanded, shaking it at me. "What are you trying to pull?" "I'm not trying to pull anything," I said, folding my arms. "I'm just reminding you that this is our home, and I'm not going to stand by while you treat me like a guest in my own space." Greg stepped back slightly, looking more uncomfortable by the second. "Hey, Julia, if this is a bad time, I can—" "No, Greg," I said, cutting him off but softening my tone. "This isn't your fault. You're just caught in the middle of something Daniel should have handled differently." "Handled differently?" Daniel snapped, his face turning red. "You're the one handling this poorly. Changing the locks? Rearranging the house? What are you even doing?" "I'm making a point," I said firmly. "For years, you've made decisions that affect both of us without consulting me. This house was supposed to be our fresh start, Daniel, but instead, you've turned it into a dumping ground for everyone else's problems. And when I asked you to talk to me about it, you told me your decision was final." "Because it is," he said, doubling down. "Greg's my best friend. He needed a place to stay, and I'm not going to apologize for helping him. And I'm not going to apologize for standing up for myself," I shot back, my voice steady but laced with steel. "If Greg stays here, it's going to be under my terms, not yours." Greg held up his hands, trying to de-escalate. "Guys, look, maybe this isn't the best time for me to move in. I don't want to be the reason you two are fighting." Daniel rounded on him, his frustration spilling over. "No, Greg, you're staying. Julia's just overreacting. She'll get over it." "I won't," I said flatly, causing both men to freeze. "This isn't something I'll get over. You've ignored me, dismissed me, and taken me for granted for years, Daniel. This time, I'm drawing the line." Daniel laughed bitterly, gesturing toward the guest room. "So what? You're going to keep me out of my own house? Good luck with that." I stepped closer, meeting his gaze head-on. "It's not just your house, Daniel. It's mine too. And unless you're willing to treat me like an equal partner, maybe you should be the one leaving." The room went silent. Greg shifted awkwardly, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Daniel looked at me like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. For the first time in years, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. "You're serious," he said finally, his voice quieter. "I've never been more serious," I replied. "You've taken me for granted for too long, Daniel. If you want this to work, you're going to have to start listening to me. If not, I'll be fine on my own." Greg cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Julia," he said hesitantly, "I think I should leave. This isn't my fight." "You're right," I said, turning to him. "It isn't. And I'm sorry you got caught in the middle of this. But this isn't about you, Greg. It's about boundaries. I hope you understand." Greg nodded, grabbing his bag and the dog's leash. "I'll figure something else out," he said, shooting a meaningful look at Daniel. "Take care of this man. Seriously." As Greg walked out the door, Daniel and I were left standing in the entryway, the tension between us thick and heavy. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, pacing back and forth. "All this over Greg staying here for a little while?" "It's not just about Greg," I said, my voice softening slightly. "It's about how you treat me. You didn't ask me. You didn't consider my feelings. You just assumed I'd go along with whatever you decided. That's not a partnership, Daniel." He stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I didn't think it was a big deal," he admitted, his tone begrudging. "I thought you'd understand." "Well, I didn't," I said, standing firm. "And if we're going to move forward, that has to change. No more unilateral decisions. No more dismissing me. I'm your wife, not a tenant in your house." Daniel didn't say anything for a long time. He just stood there, staring at the letter still crumpled in his hand. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely audible. "I get it." "Do you?" I asked, my tone skeptical. He looked up at me, his expression tired but sincere. "I do. I don't want to lose you, Julia." I nodded slowly, then start acting like it. The house felt eerily quiet after Greg left. His dog's absence, the bag he had dragged out the door, and the awkward final exchange lingered in the air. Daniel sat on the couch, his head in his hands, as if the weight of the evening was finally catching up to him. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the one who had to fix it. I busied myself in the kitchen, putting away the glasses and tidying up, mostly to give myself space to think. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew I'd said everything I needed to say. Daniel's reaction was his to process. I wasn't going to carry the burden of it for him. After a few minutes, he came into the kitchen, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "Julia?" he said, his voice softer than I'd expected. "I want to talk." I turned to face him, leaning against the counter. "I'm listening." He rubbed the back of his neck, looking anywhere but at me. "I was wrong," he said finally. "About Greg. About the way I've been treating you. I've been selfish. I didn't even think about how this would make you feel." For a moment, I didn't respond. I wanted to believe him, but I'd heard apologies before. "Do you understand why I'm upset?" I asked carefully. "I think so," he said, his brow furrowed. "It's not just about Greg moving in. It's about how I handled it, how I didn't handle it with you. I made it seem like your opinion didn't matter, and that's not okay." I nodded slowly. "No, it's not." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. I've always been the kind of guy who makes decisions quickly. I didn't realize how much that was hurting us." "You've had years to realize it," I said, my tone firm but not unkind. "And I've had years of being dismissed and overlooked. That stops now, Daniel. If you can't change, if we can't be partners, I won't stay." His face tightened at my words, but he didn't argue. Instead, he nodded. "You're right. I don't want to lose you, Julia. I know I've messed up, but I want to do better." That night, we slept in separate rooms. It wasn't out of anger, but because I needed time to process what had happened. For years, I'd carried the weight of Daniel's decisions, sacrificing my voice and my comfort for the sake of our marriage. Standing up for myself felt good, liberating even, but it also left me questioning whether things would ever truly change. I replayed the events of the evening over and over in my mind. Greg's quiet departure, Daniel's outburst, and finally, his attempt to take responsibility. Was it genuine? Could he really change after all this time? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back to the way things were. In the days that followed, Daniel made an effort. He started asking me about decisions, small ones like where to go for dinner, and bigger ones, like how we'd divide responsibilities at home. It wasn't perfect, and I could tell it wasn't easy for him, but it was a start. For the first time in years, I felt like we might actually be partners. As for me, I began focusing on what made me happy. I redecorated parts of the house to reflect my own tastes, adding personal touches that made the space feel like mine again. I spent more time with Lauren, catching up over coffee and laughing about the chaos of the past few weeks. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like myself again, stronger, more confident, and less willing to settle for anything less than what I deserved. A month later, the house felt like a completely different place, not because of the decor or the layout, but because of the energy. It was quieter, more balanced, and for the first time in years, it felt like my home. I'd spent weeks reclaiming my space, not just physically but emotionally, and that effort had paid off. Daniel had taken the confrontation to heart. He started therapy, not because I'd asked him to, but because he recognized that his behavior needed to change. He admitted one evening over dinner that he hadn't realized how much his decisions had alienated me, how his assumption that we'd figure it out had really meant, "You'll adjust." "I didn't respect you the way I should have," he said, his tone quiet but sincere. "I thought I was being a good husband by handling things on my own, but I see now that I wasn't. I was just shutting you out." It wasn't easy to hear him admit those things. A part of me wanted to scream, "Why did it take this long?" But I also knew that change wasn't instant. For the first time in our marriage, Daniel was putting in the work, and I appreciated that. It didn't erase the years of frustration, but it was a start. As for me, I'd found my voice again. The version of me that had been buried under years of compromise and silence was finally coming back to life. I set boundaries, clear, firm, and unapologetic ones, and Daniel respected them. When he asked about having Greg over for dinner one weekend, I appreciated that he phrased it as a question, not an assumption. "Dinner sounds fine," I told him, "but just dinner, not a sleepover. And Greg can leave the dog at home." He nodded. "Of course, thanks for agreeing." It was a small moment, but it felt like a win. Lauren noticed the change too. Over coffee one morning, she leaned back in her chair, grinning. "You look lighter," she said, "happier." "I feel lighter," I admitted. "For the first time in a long time, I'm not tiptoeing around him. I know what I want, and I'm not afraid to say it anymore." She raised her cup in a toast. "To finally taking up space." "To not settling for less," I said, clinking my cup against hers. There were still days when I doubted whether things would last, whether Daniel's efforts would hold. But I knew one thing for sure. I'd never lose myself in a relationship again. The person who stood at the kitchen counter, calmly delivering an ultimatum to her husband, wasn't going anywhere. The conference room buzzed with chatter as I glanced at my phone, its screen lighting up with an incoming call from Tyler. I stepped out into the hallway, expecting the usual small talk. "How's the trip? When will you be home?" Instead, Tyler's voice came through cold and smug. "I'm divorcing you," he said, his tone almost triumphant. "I've already sold the apartment, so you'll need to figure out where you're going to live. Enjoy that." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The audacity of it, the complete lack of remorse, it was almost laughable. My hand tightened around the phone as his words sunk in. "You sold the apartment?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Yeah," he said with a dry laugh. "Nicole and I need the money to set up our life together. She deserves better than a tiny place like that anyway." Nicole. The name stung, though I'd suspected for months that there was someone else. Tyler's late nights, his sudden work trips, and the mounting distance between us all pointed to a third party. But to hear him speak her name so casually, as if I were the intruder in their life, lit a fire in my chest. "Sounds good," I replied evenly. There was no way I was giving him the satisfaction of hearing me crack. "My name is Amelia, and up until that phone call, I thought I'd married a man I could trust. Tyler and I had been together for 6 years, and while things hadn't always been perfect, I'd believed in our partnership. We'd worked hard to buy our apartment, a cozy 2-bedroom in the city that I'd fallen in love with the moment I saw it. It wasn't just a home, it was a symbol of everything we'd built together. Or at least that's what I'd thought. Looking back, there had been signs, small cracks in the foundation I'd ignored. Tyler's dismissive attitude whenever I asked about finances, his tendency to brush off my concerns with a charming smile and a quick kiss. I'd always assumed his confidence came from knowing what he was doing. Now I realized it came from knowing he could manipulate me. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I sat through client meetings, nodding at all the right moments while my mind raced. Tyler thought he'd won. He thought he could pull the rug out from under me, sell the home I'd worked so hard for, and walk away scot-free. But there was one crucial detail he didn't know. The apartment deed had been in my name alone for months. I'd had it transferred after we refinanced earlier in the year, a move Tyler had agreed to without much thought because it meant a lower interest rate. He'd never bothered to ask about the details or read the paperwork he'd signed. His carelessness was going to be his undoing. By the time I returned to my hotel room that evening, my shock had turned into resolve. I wasn't going to cry or beg. Tyler wanted a fight? Fine. But this was a fight I was going to win. The first call I made was to Chloe, my lawyer and longtime friend. I laid out the situation in painstaking detail, my voice calm even as my pulse raced. "He sold the apartment?" she repeated, incredulous. Does he even realize that he can't do that without your consent? Apparently not, I said, a hint of amusement creeping into my tone. He thinks he's already spent the money on his new life with Nicole. Chloe laughed dryly. Well, he's in for a rude awakening. The sale is invalid. You can prove sole ownership, and if he's taken any money from the buyer, he's on the hook for fraud. The word fraud sent a jolt of satisfaction through me. What do we need to do? I asked. First, we'll notify the buyer that the sale isn't legal, Chloe said. Then, we'll draft a formal letter for Tyler, outlining the consequences of his actions. If he's dumb enough to try anything else, we'll take him to court. As I hung up, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. Tyler thought he'd outsmarted me, that he'd left me powerless and scrambling. But in reality, he'd just set himself up for the ultimate humiliation. I spent the rest of the trip focusing on my work, compartmentalizing my emotions and channeling my energy into the task ahead. The betrayal hurt, but the prospect of reclaiming my life and watching Tyler's smugness crumble gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. When I boarded the plane home, I was ready to face Tyler, ready to dismantle his lies, and ready to start a new chapter without him. This wasn't just about winning. It was about taking back control. The flight home gave me hours to think about how everything had unraveled. Tyler's arrogance was astounding. He hadn't even tried to hide his betrayal, as if I was just another obstacle to bulldoze on his path to freedom. But instead of spiraling into anger, I focused on what I'd do when I returned. Tyler thought I was powerless, but he didn't realize I'd been playing the long game without even knowing it. As the plane touched down, my first call was to Chloe. "I'm back," I said as I hauled my suitcase off the luggage carousel. "What's the next step?" "We've already notified the buyer," she replied, her tone brisk and efficient. They were shocked, to say the least, and not too happy with Tyler. They're willing to cooperate, which helps our case. "And Tyler?" I asked. "I sent the formal letter to his email this morning," she said. "It outlines the illegality of the sale, your sole ownership of the apartment, and the potential consequences of fraud. He hasn't responded yet, but if I had to guess, he's going to be furious." Good, I thought. Let him stew. When I arrived home, the apartment was eerily quiet. Tyler's things were still there, his jackets draped over the chair, his shoes carelessly tossed by the door, but the place felt different, like the energy had shifted. I took a deep breath and set my suitcase down, knowing that the confrontation would come soon enough. Sure enough, Tyler came storming in that evening, his face red with anger and his phone clutched in his hand. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, waving the letter Chloe had sent. "You're telling me I can't sell the apartment? It's half mine." "No, Tyler," I said calmly, crossing my arms. "It's not. The deed has been in my name for months. You can't sell something you don't own." He froze, his face a mixture of confusion and rage. "What are you talking about?" I grabbed the deed from the file I'd pulled earlier, holding it up for him to see. "After we refinanced, I had the deed transferred to my name. You signed off on it, remember? Or did you just skim the paperwork like you always do?" For a moment, he said nothing. Then his expression twisted into a sneer. "You think you're so smart, don't you? This doesn't change anything. I already made a deal, and you're going to look like a fool when it all falls apart." I stared at him, unblinking. "The sale is already void, Tyler. The buyer knows it, and they're ready to take legal action if you don't return the money. Oh, and speaking of money..." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "If you've spent a single cent of that deposit, you're in even bigger trouble." Tyler's confidence wavered for the first time. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, avoiding my gaze. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my voice steady. "You've spent years treating me like I'm too naive to notice what you're doing. But guess what, Tyler? I've been paying attention, and now you're going to deal with the consequences." He started pacing, his frustration mounting. "This is ridiculous. You're blowing everything out of proportion. You can't just kick me out of here." I raised an eyebrow. "Actually, I can. This apartment is legally mine. You can stay here for now, but only because I'm giving you the courtesy of time to figure out your next move. But let me be clear, I'm not going anywhere. Over the next few days, Tyler's anger turned into desperation. He called me repeatedly, leaving frantic voicemails that alternated between begging and threatening. Meanwhile, Chloe worked behind the scenes to ensure that every loose end was tied up. The buyer rescinded the agreement, furious at Tyler for wasting their time and money, and Chloe drafted the preliminary paperwork for the divorce proceedings. "You're in a good position, Amelia," she told me during one of our meetings. "Tyler has no leverage here. Between the voided sale and the fraud charges hanging over his head, he'll have to cooperate if he wants to avoid a bigger mess." Her words were a relief, but they also reminded me just how much I'd allowed Tyler to control my life. For years, I'd ignored his dismissiveness and arrogance, telling myself it wasn't worth the fight. But now, I saw how much I'd been giving up, and I was determined to take it all back. Lauren, my best friend, came over one evening to help me reorganize the apartment. We boxed up Tyler's things, carefully stacking them in the corner of the living room. "How's he taking all this?" she asked, holding up one of his gaudy ties with a smirk. "Not well," I said, laughing despite myself. "He's still convinced he can talk his way out of it, but I'm not budging." "Good," she said, tossing the tie into the box. "He doesn't deserve a single inch of your space or your time." I nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude for her support. For so long, I'd felt alone in my marriage, carrying the emotional and financial burden while Tyler took credit for everything. But now, I had people in my corner, and that made all the difference. The final piece of my plan fell into place the day Tyler brought Nicole to the apartment. I was sitting at the dining table reviewing some paperwork when they walked in like they owned the place. Nicole looked around with a smug smile, her arm looped through Tyler's. "So, this is where we're staying?" she said, her voice dripping with entitlement. I stood up, my heart pounding but my resolve unshaken. "No," I said firmly. "This is where Tyler was staying. You, Nicole, won't be staying here at all." Her smile faltered and she glanced at Tyler, who looked equally stunned. "What is this?" he demanded. "This," I said, gesturing to the apartment around me, "is my home. Not yours, not hers, and certainly not a hotel for you to shack up in after stabbing me in the back." Nicole's expression turned icy, but she said nothing. Tyler, on the other hand, looked like he was about to explode. "You can't do this!" he shouted. "You're being unreasonable!" I met his gaze, unflinching. "No, Tyler. What's unreasonable is thinking you could sell my home, walk away with the money, and expect me to just roll over. You're lucky I haven't filed criminal charges for now." Tyler stood in the doorway, his face red with frustration, while Nicole crossed her arms, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "You're being ridiculous, Amelia," he said, his voice laced with desperation. "You can't just kick me out of my own home." I took a step forward, my voice calm but unwavering. "This is my home, Tyler. The deed has been in my name for months, and you know that. You signed the paperwork without even reading it, just like you always do. So no, this isn't your home anymore." Nicole glanced at Tyler, her perfectly manicured hand tightening around her purse strap. "Wait, what's she talking about?" she asked, her tone sharp. "You said this was your apartment, that you sold it." He flinched, trying to wave her off. "It's complicated. I'll handle it." "Oh, it's not complicated," I said, stepping closer. "You tried to sell an apartment that doesn't belong to you. That sale is void, Tyler. And as of right now, you don't have a leg to stand on." Nicole's composure cracked. "You mean the money you told me you had—" She stopped mid-sentence, her voice rising. "Oh my God, did you lie about that too?" "Nicole, let me explain," Tyler said quickly, holding his hands up. But she wasn't having it. "No," I said, cutting him off. "Let me explain. Tyler tried to sell the apartment behind my back, thinking he could pocket the money and leave me with nothing. What he didn't know is that I had the deed transferred to my name months ago. So not only did he fail to sell it, but he also committed fraud by pretending he could. Nicole's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Fraud?" she whispered, taking a step away from him. "Are you serious?" "Yes, fraud," I said, crossing my arms, "and I'm prepared to press charges if he doesn't get his things and leave by the end of the day." Tyler's facade finally cracked. "You can't do this, Amelia," he said, his voice pleading now. "We've been together for 6 years. You can't just throw me out." "You threw me out the moment you made that phone call," I said, my voice hardening. "You told me you were divorcing me and laughed about me having to find a new place to live. You didn't just betray me, Tyler. You tried to ruin me. So don't stand there and act like you're the victim." Nicole took another step back, her eyes darting between us. "This is insane," she muttered, clutching her purse tighter. "You didn't tell me any of this, Tyler. You said you had everything handled." He turned to her, desperation written all over his face. "Nicole, I can fix this. I just need—" She cut him off with a raised hand. "Don't, just don't. I'm not getting dragged into your mess." Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out, leaving him standing there, stunned. I couldn't help but smile as the door clicked shut behind her. "Looks like you're on your own," I said, turning back to Tyler. "Now, let's talk about what happens next." He slumped onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "Amelia, please. I screwed up. I know that. But you don't have to do this." "You're right," I said, grabbing a folder from the kitchen counter and setting it on the coffee table in front of him. "I don't have to do this, but I'm going to. This is the divorce paperwork. My lawyer has already drafted it, and I suggest you sign it quickly. The sooner you do, the sooner we can both move on." He stared at the folder, his face pale. "You really hate me that much?" "Hate you?" I let out a bitter laugh. "No, Tyler, I don't hate you. I feel sorry for you. You had everything. Someone who loved you, a home we built together, and you threw it all away because you couldn't see past your own ego." I stood, my heart pounding but my resolve unshaken. "I want you out of here by the end of the day. Take your things and figure out where you're going to stay. This is the last time I'm giving you any grace." He opened his mouth to argue but stopped, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll go." "Good," I said, walking toward the door. "And don't even think about trying anything else. Chloe's already handling everything, and the next time you cross a line, I won't hesitate to let the courts handle it." As I opened the door, Tyler slowly stood, grabbing his coat. He didn't look at me as he walked out, his footsteps heavy with defeat. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, not for him, but for the life we could have had if he'd been the man I thought he was. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by a sense of relief. I closed the door behind him, locking it with the new key I'd had made. This was my home now, and no one, especially not Tyler, would take it away from me again. The silence in the apartment after Tyler left was deafening. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. The space no longer felt heavy with his presence, his entitlement, or his lies. It was just me, the home I'd built, and the quiet realization that I had won, not just against him, but against every doubt I'd ever had about standing up for myself. I stood in the middle of the living room, taking in the emptiness where his things had been. His oversized gaming chair, the framed jerseys that had cluttered the walls, and the gaudy coffee table he'd insisted on keeping were all gone. The apartment looked cleaner, brighter, like it was mine again. Lauren came by that evening with takeout and a bottle of wine. "Is he really gone?" she asked, plopping down on the couch with a dramatic sigh. "Gone and not coming back," I said, pouring 2 glasses of wine. I gave him until the end of the day to pack his things. He didn't argue. Lauren raised her glass. "To fresh starts and well-deserved victories." I clinked my glass against hers, feeling the weight of the past week slowly lifting. To never letting someone walk all over me again. Over the next few days, I began to reclaim the apartment piece by piece. I rearranged the furniture, moved my favorite artwork into the living room, and filled the space with things that made me happy. It wasn't just about redecorating, it was about turning the apartment into a reflection of who I was, not the person Tyler had tried to make me. Chloe called with updates on the legal proceedings, her voice filled with the kind of confidence that made me feel invincible. "The fraud charges are off the table since the buyer decided not to pursue them," she explained, "but the divorce paperwork is moving along smoothly. Once Tyler signs, you'll be officially free." Hearing the word free made my chest tighten. It wasn't just about the divorce. It was about everything I'd been carrying for years. The resentment, the self-doubt, the feeling of being trapped in a marriage that didn't value me. It was all finally being lifted. Tyler tried to reach out a few times. His messages ranged from half-hearted apologies to pathetic attempts to guilt me into reconciling. "I made a mistake," one read. "Can't we at least talk about this?" Another was more desperate. "You're going to ruin me, Amelia. Is that what you want?" I didn't reply. For once, I wasn't going to waste my energy trying to fix something that was broken beyond repair. He'd made his choices, and now he was dealing with the consequences. By the end of the week, the apartment felt like a completely new space, warm, inviting, and entirely mine. As I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, the city lights twinkling outside the window, I thought about everything that had happened. Tyler's betrayal had been a shock, but it had also been a wake-up call. For too long, I'd let myself believe that I didn't deserve better, that I had to settle for whatever scraps of respect and love he decided to throw my way. But now, I knew better. I wasn't just reclaiming my apartment, I was reclaiming my life. A month later, my life looked completely different. The apartment was unrecognizable, not because of any drastic renovations, but because of how it felt. It was a space that reflected me, my tastes, my personality, and my newfound independence. The absence of Tyler's clutter and his overbearing presence made the home feel lighter, freer. The divorce was moving along smoothly. Chloe had handled everything with precision, ensuring Tyler had no room to argue or complicate the process. He signed the papers without much fuss, likely realizing that he had no leverage. There was no grand showdown, no emotional plea to work things out. Just a cold, clean break that felt both bittersweet and deeply satisfying. One day, as I sorted through some old papers, I came across a photo of Tyler and me from our early years together. We were smiling, arms around each other, full of hope and promise. I stared at it for a moment, letting the memories wash over me. There had been good times, moments when I truly believed we were building a life together. But those moments were gone, overshadowed by years of neglect, manipulation, and betrayal. I tucked the photo into an envelope and put it away in a drawer. It wasn't worth keeping out in the open, but I wasn't ready to throw it away either. It was a part of my past, but it didn't define me anymore. Lauren and I celebrated the finalized divorce with dinner and drinks at a trendy rooftop bar downtown. "You're glowing," she said, raising her cocktail in a toast. "Single life suits you." I laughed, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in years. "It's not the single life," I said. "It's the freedom. For the first time, I don't feel like I'm living under someone else's rules." We toasted to that, and as the night went on, I felt a growing sense of pride in myself. I'd faced one of the hardest moments of my life and come out stronger. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Back at home, I started planning for the future. The apartment had become more than a refuge. It was a symbol of everything I'd reclaimed. But I knew I wouldn't stay there forever. Someday, I'd move to a new place, one without any lingering shadows of my life with Tyler. Until then, I was determined to make the most of every moment in the space I had fought so hard to keep. As I curled up on the couch that night, a sense of peace washed over me. I thought about how Tyler had laughed during that phone call, so certain that he'd won, and I couldn't help but smile. His arrogance had been his downfall, and my quiet strength had been my salvation. This wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I called the shots, one where I chose happiness on my own terms. And after a long time, I felt truly free. Thanks for the upgrade, my dear. Ethan grinned as he strolled into the living room, tossing his sunglasses onto the coffee table. He stood there obnoxiously confident in his tailored suit and pristine new shoes, his luggage spilling high-end logos. First class to Europe, luxury hotels, this is the kind of life I've been missing, Sarah. I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. What's so funny? He snapped, frowning. Oh, Ethan, I said, shaking my head. You have no idea what you've done. My name is Sarah, and I'm 34 years old. I work in cybersecurity, and for the last 7 years, I've been married to a man who turned out to be a walking red flag disguised as charm. Ethan was always the smooth talker, the dreamer, the one who made everything sound like a brilliant plan. Meanwhile, I was the one who made those plans happen, holding down a steady career while he bounced from one half-baked scheme to the next. I ignored the warning signs, the financial secrecy, the constant excuses for his lack of income, because I wanted to believe we were a team. But at 2 a.m. last week, Ethan made a mistake he couldn't charm his way out of. I'd been asleep upstairs when it happened. He must have waited until he was sure I was out cold before sneaking down to my laptop. My cybersecurity work had taught me to keep an eye on potential scams, but I never thought I'd need those skills at home. That night, Ethan used my laptop to access one of my credit cards. He copied down the details, snapped a few pictures with his phone, and slinked back into bed like nothing had happened. The next morning, while sipping my coffee, I noticed a flood of alerts on my phone. I opened my banking app to find nearly $50,000 in charges. Designer clothing, expensive watches, first-class flights to Paris. My stomach sank as the pieces clicked into place. Ethan was behind this. Of course he was. But instead of panicking, I smiled. The card he'd used wasn't a personal account. It was a dummy credit card tied to a training program I run at work. It's designed to teach companies how to detect and respond to fraud. Every transaction triggers an automatic alert that goes straight to the authorities. Ethan had no idea he'd just turned himself into a case study. I called my lawyer, Chloe, that same morning. You're not going to believe this, I told her, recounting everything in detail. She didn't even try to hold back her laughter. Wait, let me get this straight, she said between chuckles. He stole a dummy card? The one that's linked to fraud detection? Exactly, I said, my voice calm but edged with satisfaction. I don't think he realized what he was doing. He probably thought he was being clever. Clever? Chloe said. He's a moron. Every charge he makes is going to get flagged. Have the authorities contacted you yet? Not yet, but it's only a matter of time. For the rest of the week, I stayed quiet, waiting to see how far Ethan would take it. He left a note on the counter a couple of days later. Taking some time for myself. Don't wait up. I knew exactly what that meant. He was using my stolen money to live it up abroad. Every night, I watched the fraud alerts roll in. High-end restaurants, 5-star hotels, and extravagant shopping sprees. Each notification felt like a small victory. 3 days into his spree, I got a call from Agent Keller, a federal investigator assigned to the case. We've identified significant fraudulent activity tied to your account, he said. Do you know who might be responsible? Yes, I replied without hesitation. My husband. There was a brief pause. Your husband? I explained the situation, including the fact that the card was part of a cybersecurity program. Agent Keller let out a low whistle. That's a new one, he said. You'll need to provide a formal statement, but based on what we've already flagged, he's in serious trouble. By the time Ethan walked back through the door, his ego inflated from a week of indulgence, I was ready. He sauntered into the living room like nothing had happened, wearing the spoils of his stolen spree. Thanks for the upgrade, he said with a cocky grin. You really outdid yourself this time. I couldn't stop the laughter that bubbled out of me. Ethan frowned, clearly expecting me to be furious. What's so funny? He asked, his voice sharp. Oh, Ethan, I said, shaking my head. You're about to find out. Ethan dropped his designer duffel bag onto the floor with a smug thud. "Seriously though, Sarah," he said, shrugging off his tailored jacket and draping it over the back of the couch. "You should have told me about that card ages ago. Imagine how much fun we could have had." I leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. "And how exactly did you think this was going to end?" He smirked, kicking off his shoes. "You're always so uptight about money. It's not like you couldn't afford it. I figured you'd get over it once you saw how happy it made me." His sheer audacity would have been infuriating if it weren't so pathetic. I bit back a laugh, knowing that every second he spent bragging was another nail in his coffin. "So, the watches, the flights, the hotels, you thought all of that was just a gift from me?" "Not thought," he said, pointing at himself. "Knew. It's about time you loosened up." I smiled, a tight-lipped expression that told him nothing. "I'll bet." Once Ethan disappeared into the shower, humming some obnoxious tune, I picked up my phone and texted Chloe. "He's back, ready to move forward." Her reply was immediate. "Perfect. I'll alert Agent Keller." Over the past week, Chloe and Agent Keller had been preparing the case against Ethan. His every move had been tracked, every charge meticulously logged. From the designer clothing boutiques to the luxury hotels in Paris, his indulgence painted a picture of someone who thought they were untouchable. Ethan had no idea how deep he'd dug his own grave. Agent Keller had assured me that the fraud alerts from the dummy account had already triggered a full investigation. "We'll bring him in for questioning once you're ready," he'd said during our last call. "But I'd recommend letting him walk into it on his own. The more confident he is, the better." Now, as I listened to Ethan's off-key singing echo from the bathroom, I felt an almost surreal sense of calm. For years, I'd let him take advantage of my trust, my kindness, my stability. But this time, he was about to face the consequences of underestimating me. After Ethan emerged, wrapped in a plush towel and grinning like he didn't have a care in the world, he flopped onto the couch. "You should have seen Paris," he said, reaching into his bag to pull out a shiny gold watch. "The shops, the restaurants, it was like a dream." "Sounds incredible," I said, leaning against the doorway. "Tell me more." He launched into a detailed account of his week-long spree, complete with exaggerated hand gestures and unnecessary details about the champagne quality at some rooftop bar. Every word felt like an indictment, a confession he didn't even realize he was making. He had no idea I was recording the entire conversation on my phone, the file ready to be forwarded to Agent Keller. "And the best part?" Ethan said, holding up the watch to admire it. "Nobody suspected a thing. Not even you." The next morning, Chloe and I met over coffee to finalize the timeline. "He's got no defense," she said, scrolling through the evidence we'd compiled. "The fraud alerts, the charges, his conversation from last night, it's airtight. Agent Keller is ready to bring him in for questioning. They're coordinating with the local police to execute the arrest." I nodded, the weight of everything finally starting to settle in. "What happens after that?" "He'll face multiple charges, including fraud, identity theft, and unauthorized use of a financial account," Chloe explained. "Given the amount of money involved, it won't be a slap on the wrist. Best case scenario for him? He cuts a deal and avoids jail time. Worst case? He's looking at years behind bars." A part of me wanted to feel sorry for him. But then I remembered the smug grin on his face, the way he'd flaunted his stolen goods without a second thought about the damage he'd caused. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern of selfishness and entitlement that I'd been blind to for far too long. Later that evening, as Ethan lounged on the couch scrolling through his phone, I heard the unmistakable sound of a knock at the door. My heart raced, not with fear, but with anticipation. I walked to the door and opened it to reveal Agent Keller and two uniformed officers standing on the porch. "Good evening, Ms. Miller," Keller said, his tone professional but warm. "Is Ethan home?" "He's right inside," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "Feel free to make yourselves comfortable." Ethan looked up from his phone, his brows knitting together in confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, sitting up straighter. Agent Keller approached him with a calm authority that made the room feel smaller. "Ethan Miller, you're under investigation for multiple counts of credit card fraud and unauthorized use of financial accounts. We'd like you to come with us for questioning." Ethan's face went pale, his confidence evaporating in an instant. "What? No, this has to be a mistake," he stammered, looking to me for support. "Sarah, tell them, this is crazy." I crossed my arms, tilting my head slightly. "I don't know, Ethan. You've been awfully busy lately. Maybe you should explain it to them." As the officers read him his rights and led him toward the door, Ethan continued to protest. "You can't do this. Sarah, this is a setup. You're my wife. Aren't you supposed to stand by me?" "Funny," I said, leaning against the doorway. "I thought husbands weren't supposed to steal from their wives. Guess we're both learning something today." Ethan glared at me, his bravado replaced by desperation. "You won't get away with this." I smiled. "Oh, Ethan. I already have." The door shut with a sharp click as the officers escorted Ethan out, leaving the living room eerily silent. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where he'd been standing just minutes ago. My heart was racing, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. He was gone. Finally, undeniably gone. But this wasn't over. Not yet. About an hour later, Chloe called. "He's with Agent Keller now," she said, her voice calm but firm. "They've started questioning him. From what Keller told me, Ethan is already trying to spin the story in his favor." "Of course he is," I said, rolling my eyes. "Let me guess. He's playing the victim?" "Spot on," Chloe replied with a dry laugh. "He's claiming you gave him permission to use the card. But don't worry. Between the fraud alerts, the charges, and your recording, he doesn't stand a chance." The next morning, Agent Keller called with an update. "We've got everything we need," he said. "Your husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, admitted to using the card, but insists he didn't know it was tied to a fraud detection program. He's trying to blame the mix-up on you." "That sounds about right," I said, leaning back in my chair. "What happens next?" "We're moving forward with the charges," Keller explained. "He's facing multiple counts of fraud and unauthorized use of a financial account. Given the amount of money involved, he'll be looking at significant consequences. The buyer protection programs flagged his luxury purchases, so those are being reimbursed. You're not liable for a cent." The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming. For days, I'd carried the weight of Ethan's actions, worried that somehow he'd managed to slip through the cracks. But now, hearing Keller's confidence, I realized the full extent of my victory. "Thank you," I said, "for everything." "Don't thank me," Keller said. "This case practically handed itself to us. You handled this brilliantly." The fallout hit Ethan harder than I expected. Word spread quickly among our mutual friends and acquaintances about his arrest, and it wasn't long before his carefully crafted image of the charming, carefree husband began to crumble. Nicole, the woman I suspected he'd been seeing, apparently dropped him the moment she heard about the charges. The designer goods he'd flaunted were confiscated, the flights he'd booked were canceled, and the banks froze his accounts. One evening, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered, and sure enough, it was Ethan. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and strained. I need to talk to you." I couldn't help but laugh. "Ethan, the only thing you need to do is figure out how to explain yourself to the judge." "Please," he said, his tone shifting to desperation. "I messed up, okay? I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just..." "Just what?" I interrupted, my voice cold. "Just trying to steal $50,000 from me? Just hoping I wouldn't notice? Just banking on me being too blind or too forgiving to stop you?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he muttered, "I thought you loved me." I let out a sharp breath, my anger boiling over. "I did, Ethan. I loved the person I thought you were. But the person who stole from me, who lied to me, who thought he could get away with it, that's not someone I could ever love." Before he could respond, I hung up. A week later, Chloe called to confirm that Ethan had accepted a plea deal. "He's avoiding jail time," she explained, "but he'll have to pay back every cent he tried to steal and complete community service. Plus, his credit is going to be in shambles for years." "That sounds fitting," I said. "He always wanted the high life. Now he gets to see how the other half lives." Chloe laughed. "You're handling this way better than most people would." "It's funny," I said, smiling to myself. "For years, I thought Ethan was the one who held things together in our marriage. I thought his charm, his ambition, his big ideas were what kept us moving forward. But now I see it clearly. I was the one holding everything up. He was just dead weight." The day the divorce papers came through, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch, looking around the apartment that now felt wholly and completely mine. Ethan's absence wasn't a loss. It was a gift, a chance to rebuild my life without the constant shadow of his selfishness. As I sipped my wine, I thought about the moment he'd walked through the door, flaunting his stolen goods and mocking me for the supposed upgrade he'd given himself. He'd been so confident, so sure of his own brilliance, and now he was the one paying the price. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of a life I could finally call my own. The apartment felt eerily quiet in the days after Ethan's arrest. His things were gone, what little he hadn't sold or stuffed into his designer duffel bag, but the space felt lighter, almost like the weight of his betrayal had been physically lifted. For the first time in years, I could sit in my own home without feeling his shadow looming over me. Chloe stopped by one afternoon to drop off some final paperwork. "How are you holding up?" she asked, sitting on the couch with her usual no-nonsense demeanor. "Better than I thought I would," I admitted, handing her a cup of coffee. "It's strange, but I don't even feel angry anymore, just relieved." She smiled knowingly. "That's because you've already won. You didn't just survive this, Sarah. You came out stronger." Yeah. I thought about that as we went through the documents, finalizing the details of Ethan's financial restitution. It wasn't just about the money, though knowing he'd be paying back every cent was satisfying. It was about finally reclaiming my independence. For years, I'd let Ethan dictate the terms of our relationship, thinking it was easier to keep the peace. But now, I realized that peace built on compromise and silence wasn't peace at all. The official letter of divorce arrived a week later, delivered in an unassuming envelope that felt far too small to contain something so monumental. I held it for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in, before tearing it open. My eyes scanned the lines of legal jargon until I found the words that mattered most. Finalized and irrevocable. I sat down at the kitchen table, the letter in my hands, and allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. This wasn't the life I'd imagined when I married Ethan. I'd pictured stability, partnership, and a future built on mutual trust. But now, as I looked around the home I'd rebuilt for myself, I realized I had something better. Freedom, clarity, and the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever given myself credit for. Lauren came over that evening with a bottle of wine and a carton of my favorite takeout. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her glass, "and to the absolute dumpster fire you just walked away from." I laughed, clinking my glass against hers. "To never settling for less than I deserve." Over the next few weeks, I started to piece together what my new life would look like. I redecorated the apartment, adding splashes of color and personal touches that felt like me. I finally took the solo vacation I'd been dreaming about for years, exploring the coast and soaking in the kind of peace that only comes from leaving everything behind for a little while. Ethan tried to reach out a few more times, through mutual acquaintances, vague apologies over email, even a laughably tone-deaf letter claiming he'd changed. But I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He'd made his choices, and I'd made mine. Every now and then, I'd hear updates about his life through the grapevine. He was struggling to find work, his reputation tarnished by the fraud charges. He'd moved back in with his parents, apparently still clinging to the belief that he could talk his way out of anything. I didn't feel sorry for him. If anything, I felt relief. He wasn't my problem anymore. A month after everything had been finalized, I stood by the window of my apartment, sipping my morning coffee and watching the city come to life below. The sunlight poured into the living room, highlighting the fresh coat of paint I'd picked out, my favorite shade of blue. The space no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like home. It was peaceful, mine, and filled with possibilities. I thought about the journey that had brought me here. For years, I'd believed in the promise of marriage, in the idea of building a life with Ethan. I'd ignored the little voice inside me that whispered something was off, that warned me his charm was a mask for selfishness. But now, I understood something important. Walking away wasn't failure. It was strength. Lauren and I met for brunch that weekend, a new ritual we'd started since Ethan's exit. Over mimosas and waffles, she asked, "So, what's next for you?" I smiled, feeling a mix of excitement and calm that had eluded me for so long. Honestly, I'm just focusing on myself for now. Work's going great, and I've been thinking about taking a longer vacation, maybe somewhere quiet, near the mountains. She raised her glass. "That's what I like to hear. You deserve it." For the first time in years, I felt like I was making decisions purely for me. No compromises, no second guessing, just the freedom to live on my own terms. Occasionally, I'd still get updates about Ethan from mutual acquaintances. He was struggling to rebuild his life, moving from one low-paying job to the next, while trying to pay back the money he owed. The designer suits and luxury trips were long gone, replaced by a harsh reality he wasn't prepared for. I didn't dwell on it. He'd made his choices, and I'd made mine. The last time I heard from him was through an email, a long, rambling apology that seemed more self-pitying than sincere. I read the first few lines before deleting it without a reply. I didn't need closure from him. I'd already found it in myself. One evening, I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine, reflecting on everything I'd been through. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the fight to reclaim what was mine. It had all led to this moment. And while it hadn't been easy, it had been worth it. I no longer felt angry or bitter about what had happened. If anything, I felt grateful. Ethan's betrayal had forced me to confront my own strength, to stop compromising and start prioritizing myself. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to value my independence, and to never again let someone else take the reins of my life. As the city lights flickered in the distance, I raised my glass to the night sky. "Here's to me," I said quietly. "Here's to starting over." And with that, I closed the chapter on Ethan for good, ready to embrace whatever came next. "You're joking, right?" My voice cracked as I stared at the statement on my phone. Every penny I'd spent years saving for a down payment, gone. Where's my money? Maria, my mother, didn't even bother looking up from her coffee. "Oh, relax, Juliana. It went to something important." "Important?" I nearly choked. "It's all gone. Where did it go?" She glanced at Greg, my stepfather, who sat next to her with a smug grin, swirling his coffee like we were having a casual chat. "The party," Maria said, her tone dismissive, as if she'd just explained where the car keys were. "We needed a little extra to make it special." "You used my savings to pay for your anniversary party." My hands trembled as I clutched the phone. "That was for my house. You had no right." Greg chuckled, finally chiming in. "We're your parents," he said, leaning back. "We don't owe you anything, Juliana. Families share. You'll get over it." My name is Juliana, and for as long as I can remember, my mother and stepfather have treated me like a second-class citizen in my own family. My dad died when I was 12, leaving behind not just a void in my life, but a modest inheritance he'd hoped would give me a head start in adulthood. He trusted Maria to handle it until I was old enough to use it responsibly. Instead, she treated it like a family piggy bank. For years, I stayed quiet, letting little infractions slide. I didn't say much when she dipped into the fund for emergencies or used it to cover Greg's credit card debt. But this time was different. This wasn't a couple $100s here and there. It was my entire down payment, Nearly $25,000, blown on catering, decorations, and some overpriced venue so they could show off to their friends. I wasn't just angry. I was heartbroken. I'd worked so hard to save that money, working extra shifts, skipping vacations, even living in a smaller apartment just to scrape together every dollar. And now, in one selfish move, they'd taken it all away. "I want it back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're going to pay me back every cent." Maria rolled her eyes, setting her mug down with a clink. "Don't be so dramatic, Juliana. It's not like you're homeless. You can always save more." "It's not about that," I snapped. "It's about the fact that you stole from me. That money was mine." Greg smirked, clearly enjoying the show. "Technically, it was your dad's money, and we're your parents. We're the ones who decide what's best for the family." The word family hit me like a slap. For years, they'd used that word to justify everything, from borrowing money without asking to dismissing my feelings whenever they crossed the line. But this wasn't family. This was theft. "I'm not letting this go," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "Do what you have to," Maria said with a shrug, picking up her coffee like she hadn't just ripped my dreams away. "But don't expect us to apologize. We did what was necessary." I left their house that day shaking, the air in my lungs thick with frustration. Elena, my best friend, was the first person I called. I spilled the whole story, pacing my tiny apartment as the reality of what had happened sank in. "They're unbelievable," she said, her voice full of disbelief. "How could they think this is okay?" "Because they don't care," I said bitterly. "They've never cared. As far as they're concerned, I'm just a backup plan, something to use whenever it's convenient." "What are you going to do?" she asked. I didn't have an answer yet. Part of me wanted to scream at them until they understood how much they'd hurt me. Another part wanted to crawl into bed and pretend none of this was happening. But the strongest part, the part my dad raised to stand up for myself, knew exactly what needed to be done. "I'm going to get my money back," I said, my voice firm, "even if it means calling the police." By the time I hung up with Elena, my anger had crystallized into determination. I wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. My parents, no, Maria and Greg, had crossed a line they couldn't uncross, and I was done playing the role of the dutiful daughter who kept quiet for the sake of family. They stole from me. It was time to show them there were consequences. The next morning, I called the bank to confirm what I already knew. Maria had accessed my savings account using an old joint authorization she'd somehow convinced me to keep years ago. Just in case. She transferred every last penny out 2 weeks before the party, with no intention of telling me. "That's not legal, right?" I asked the bank manager, my voice shaky but firm. "It's a gray area," he admitted, his tone cautious. "Since it was a joint account, she technically had access. But given the circumstances, it's worth pursuing legally, especially if the funds were earmarked for you." "Thank you," I said, jotting down the details he provided. "I'll be in touch." My next call was to Chloe, a lawyer Elena had recommended. Over coffee that afternoon, I explained everything. The savings account, the stolen money, and Maria's unapologetic response. Chloe listened intently, her pen flying across a notepad as I spoke. "This isn't just unethical. It's potentially criminal," she said once I finished. "Even with joint access, there are limits to what she can do with those funds, especially if you can prove they were specifically intended for your use." I nodded, hope flickering to life for the first time since this nightmare began. "So, what's my next step?" "First, we'll file a report with the police to establish a paper trail," she said. "Then we'll draft a formal demand for repayment. If they refuse, and something tells me they will, we can escalate to legal action." The thought of involving the police made my stomach churn. But when I thought about the hours I'd spent working overtime, the vacations I'd skipped, and the sacrifices I'd made to save that money, my resolve hardened. Maria and Greg thought they could walk all over me because I was their daughter. It was time to prove them wrong. Filing the police report was both nerve-wracking and oddly liberating. Sitting across from the officer at the station, I recounted the entire story, showing him copies of the bank statement Chloe had helped me pull together. "So, your stepmother accessed your account without your consent and used the money for personal expenses?" the officer summarized, his pen poised over the form. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "She used it to pay for a party. I had no idea until after the fact." He nodded, jotting down notes. "This falls under unauthorized use of funds, given the circumstances. We'll open a case and follow up with your parents. You'll want to let your lawyer know so she can coordinate on her end." As I left the station, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. For once, I wasn't letting them get away with it. The fallout began 2 days later when Maria called me, her voice tight with anger. "What the hell is this?" she demanded. "The police just showed up asking about your precious savings." "It's exactly what it looks like," I said calmly. "You stole from me, so now you're dealing with the consequences." "Stole?" she scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous, Juliana. We're family. That money was for all of us." "No, it wasn't," I shot back. "It was for me. Dad left it for me, and you had no right to touch it." Greg chimed in from the background, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, come on. Don't tell me you're taking this seriously. What are you going to do? Take us to court?" "If I have to," I said. "You brought this on yourselves." Maria let out a bitter laugh. "You're being dramatic. Do you really think this is going to get you anywhere?" "We'll see," I replied before hanging up. Meanwhile, Chloe was working behind the scenes to prepare for the next step. She'd already sent a formal demand letter to Maria and Greg, outlining the amount they owed and giving them a deadline to repay it. As expected, they ignored it. "They're doubling down," Chloe said during one of our meetings, "which is exactly what we want. The more resistant they are, the worse it'll look for them if this goes to court." "And if they refuse altogether?" I asked. "Then we escalate," she said simply. "But don't worry, you're in a strong position. Between the police report, the bank records, and your father's will, we've got more than enough to back up your case." Her confidence bolstered mine. For the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand. Maria and Greg had always treated me like I was powerless, but now I was proving that I wasn't. The final straw came when Greg posted a smug photo from their anniversary party on social media, complete with a caption thanking their friends and family for making the night so special. The image of him raising a champagne glass, standing next to Maria in her rented designer dress, made my blood boil. They were still reveling in their victory, blissfully unaware of what was coming next. "Enjoy it while it lasts," I muttered to myself, saving the photo as evidence. When I showed it to Chloe later that day, she shook her head, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "They're making this way too easy," she said. "Let's make sure that champagne toast is one they'll never forget." It was a week later when the fallout finally came to a head. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sipping coffee, when my phone buzzed. It was Chloe. "They've been served," she said, her voice crisp with satisfaction. "The demand letter is now officially part of the case file, and the police are following up with a formal notice of investigation." I leaned back, feeling a mix of relief and anticipation. "How do you think they'll react?" "Oh, they'll panic," Chloe said. "And when people panic, they either double down or crumble. Either way, we win." Sure enough, Maria called me later that day, her tone frantic and defensive. "Juliana, what are you doing?" she demanded. "You're really going through with this? You'd put your own family through the legal system over a little misunderstanding?" I took a deep breath, keeping my voice calm. "This wasn't a misunderstanding, Maria. You stole from me. And if you thought I'd just let it slide, you were wrong." "We didn't steal," she shouted. "We borrowed. It was for the party. You should be proud we could celebrate as a family." I couldn't help but laugh, the sound bitter and sharp. "Celebrate? You mean flaunt my money in front of your friends, while I'm stuck scrambling to rebuild my savings? No, Maria. That's not family. That's selfishness." Greg grabbed the phone from her, his voice oozing with condescension. You're blowing this out of proportion, kiddo. Nobody's going to side with you on this. We're your parents. We've sacrificed for you. Don't you think you owe us a little gratitude? Gratitude? My voice cracked, anger bubbling to the surface. For what? For taking what wasn't yours? For mocking me when I asked you to pay me back? No, Greg. The only thing I owe you is accountability. And trust me, you're about to get it. That evening, the police knocked on their door. Chloe had warned me not to expect fireworks. It wasn't an arrest, just a formal inquiry. But I couldn't help imagining their faces as the officers explained the seriousness of the situation. Sure enough, Maria called me again, this time with a completely different tone. "Juliana, please," she said, her voice shaking. "You didn't need to bring the police into this. We can talk about it, figure something out." "We tried talking," I reminded her. "You laughed in my face and told me to get over it. Now it's out of my hands." Her voice cracked. "This could ruin us. Do you really want to do that to your own mother?" The irony of her words hit me like a slap. Your own mother. As if she hadn't already ruined the trust between us. As if her actions didn't scream that she cared more about appearances than about me. "I didn't do this to you," I said quietly. "You did it to yourself." A week later, we were sitting across from each other at a mediation table. Chloe sat by my side, her presence steady and reassuring, while Maria and Greg fidgeted in their chairs. They looked different now, less smug, more uncertain. The reality of their situation was finally sinking in. The mediator, a calm, middle-aged man with glasses, cleared his throat. "We're here to discuss the unauthorized use of Juliana's savings account and determine an appropriate resolution. Juliana, would you like to begin?" I nodded, my voice steady as I laid out the facts. That money was meant for my down payment on a house. I spent years saving it. Maria and Greg emptied the account without my knowledge and used it to pay for a party. When I asked them to pay me back, they refused and mocked me. "I'm here to get what's mine." Maria tried to interrupt, but the mediator held up a hand. "You'll have your turn, Mrs. Grant." She sank back in her chair, her face tight with anger. When it was her turn to speak, Maria's voice was shaky but defensive. "We didn't mean any harm. We thought it was better for the family to celebrate. Juliana's young. She has time to save more. We didn't realize she'd take it this far." "You didn't realize?" Chloe cut in, her voice sharp. "You drained her account without permission and then dismissed her concerns. That's not a misunderstanding. That's theft." Greg opened his mouth to argue, but one look from the mediator silenced him. "Let's stick to the facts," the mediator said. "Based on the evidence, it's clear the funds were intended for Juliana's use. Mrs. Grant, Mr. Grant, you have two options. Repay the full amount immediately, or face a civil suit, potentially accompanied by criminal charges." Maria's face turned red, her composure cracking. "We don't have that kind of money lying around," she snapped. "We spent it on the party." "Then you'll need to figure out a way to repay her," the mediator said firmly. "Otherwise, we proceed with legal action." For a moment, there was silence. Then Greg leaned forward, his voice low. "What if we agree to a payment plan?" Chloe raised an eyebrow. "That's a start," she said. "But Juliana has the final say." I looked at them, seeing not the untouchable figures of authority they'd always tried to be, but two flawed, selfish people scrambling to avoid the consequences of their actions. "A payment plan is fine," I said finally, "but I want it in writing, and if you miss even one payment, the deal's off." They nodded reluctantly, their bravado completely gone. As we left the mediation room, Chloe put a hand on my shoulder. "You did good," she said. "They won't forget this." Neither would I. The mediation agreement was signed that same day, and as I walked out of the building, I felt a weight lift off my chest. It wasn't just about the money anymore, though getting it back was a relief. It was about standing up for myself. For years, I'd let Maria and Greg take advantage of me, convincing myself that it was easier to stay silent. But not this time. This time, I'd made them face the consequences. and they couldn't wriggle out of it. Chloe met me at the door, holding a copy of the agreement. "They'll be making monthly payments directly into your account," she said, giving me a proud smile. "If they so much as miss one, we're ready to file a lawsuit." "Thanks for everything, Chloe," I said. "I couldn't have done this without you." "You did the hard part," she replied. "I just made sure the system worked for you." The first payment came through a week later, and while it wasn't the full amount, seeing even a fraction of my savings back in my account was like a balm for my anger. Elena came over that evening to celebrate, bringing takeout and a bottle of wine. "To never letting anyone walk all over you again," she said, raising her glass. "To finally standing up for myself," I replied, clinking mine against hers. As we talked, I realized how much had changed in the past few weeks. For so long, I'd put Maria and Greg's needs ahead of my own, convincing myself that family obligations outweighed my feelings. But this experience had shown me that boundaries weren't just important, they were necessary. If I didn't protect my own interests, no one else would. Maria called a few days later, her tone hesitant and unusually subdued. "Juliana, I wanted to check in," she said, as if we hadn't just been through a legal battle. I let her words hang in the air for a moment before replying. "Is this about the payments?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "No," she said quickly. "I just wanted to see how you're doing." I didn't believe her for a second. She wasn't calling out of concern. She was calling because she didn't know how to handle the new dynamic between us. For the first time, she couldn't guilt or manipulate me into giving her what she wanted. "I'm doing fine," I said, "and I expect the next payment on time." There was a pause, and then she sighed. "We're family, Juliana. I hope one day you can forgive us." I didn't respond to that. Forgiveness was a long way off, and it wasn't something she could demand just because it suited her. "I have to go," I said, ending the call before she could say anything else. Over the next few weeks, I started to rebuild, not just my savings, but my sense of self. I adjusted my budget, picked up a few extra shifts, and focused on the future. The dream of buying my own home was still alive, and while Maria and Greg's payments weren't enough to cover everything, they were a start. Every time a payment hit my account, it felt like a small victory, a reminder that I had taken control of my life. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about proving to myself that I was stronger than the people who had tried to take advantage of me. And I was. Months later, as I scrolled through real estate listings, I felt a flicker of hope I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. The savings were growing steadily, partly from my own hard work, partly from Maria and Greg's payments. While the process was slower than I'd planned, the goal of buying my own home was back within reach. I smiled as I bookmarked a listing for a small but charming house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine, or at least it would be soon. And this time, no one would take it away from me. Maria and Greg continued their payments, though not without the occasional grumble. They'd tried to negotiate for lower amounts, citing financial strain, but Chloe had shut them down each time. The terms were clear, and any deviation would result in immediate legal action. They had no choice but to comply. I didn't hear from them often, which was fine by me. When Maria did call, it was usually under the guise of checking in, though her real motive was always clear. "We've learned our lesson," she said during one call, her voice strained. "I hope we can move past this someday." I didn't bother sugarcoating my response. "Moving past this starts with you taking responsibility, Maria, and that means finishing what you started." There was silence on the other end before she muttered a curt goodbye. I hung up, feeling no guilt. For the first time, I wasn't bending over backward to make someone else feel better at my expense. It was freeing. Elena and I celebrated my progress one evening over dinner. As we clinked glasses, she said, "You know, I've never seen you like this, so confident. It looks good on you." "Thanks," I said, smiling. "I guess I finally realized that standing up for myself doesn't make me a bad person. It just makes me... me. And you are pretty awesome," she said with a wink. We laughed, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The betrayal, the anger, the fight, it had all been worth it. Not just to reclaim my savings, but to reclaim my self-respect. A few weeks later, I drove by the house I'd bookmarked. I parked across the street, imagining myself inside, filling it with my things, my life, my future. It wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of everything I'd worked for and everything I'd overcome. As I sat there, I thought about my dad. He'd worked so hard to provide for me, to make sure I had a foundation to build on. Maria and Greg had tried to take that from me, but they hadn't succeeded. I knew he'd be proud, not just of the house I'd soon own, but of the strength I'd found in myself. I took a deep breath and smiled. This was my life, and it was finally mine to build. I don't understand. Where's my money? I asked, staring at the nearly empty balance on the banking app. My chest tightened as I scrolled through the transactions again, hoping I'd somehow missed something. But no, the balance was unmistakable. Almost $10,000, the money I'd worked for every summer since high school, was gone. Edward, my stepfather, sat across the kitchen table, casually flipping through the mail. He didn't even look up. Relax, Clarice, it's not gone. I moved it into a better account for you, higher interest and all that. I blinked, trying to process his words. You moved it? Without telling me? He finally glanced up, his expression calm and patronizing. You'll thank me later. It's earning more for you this way. Something about his tone didn't sit right with me. What account? I asked, my voice sharper now. Show me. Oh, it's tied up in some obligations right now, he said, waving his hand dismissively. But don't worry, it's being put to good use. My name is Clarice, and I've been saving for my future since I was 16. I worked every summer, sometimes 2 jobs, juggling shifts at the coffee shop in the mornings and the ice cream stand in the evenings. I'd skipped vacations with friends, passed on new clothes, and ate more ramen than I'd like to admit, all to build my savings. That money was supposed to be my ticket to independence. I didn't know yet if I'd use it for tuition, a down payment on a place of my own, or maybe even a trip to Europe one day. All I knew was that it was mine, and I'd earned every cent of it. Edward and my mom, Margaret, had always been dismissive of my efforts, brushing off my plans with comments like, "You're young, you have time to figure it out." But I'd never thought they'd outright take from me, until now. The full truth came out later that evening. After hours of pestering Edward, I finally cornered Margaret in the living room. "Where's my money, Mom?" I demanded, my voice trembling with frustration. "Edward said he moved it into some account, but he won't tell me where." She hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where Edward was fixing himself a drink. "Look, Clarice," she began, her voice soft but firm. "It's not as bad as you think." "That's not an answer," I snapped. "What did you do with it?" Her face tightened, and I knew immediately that whatever she was about to say would make my blood boil. "We used it to pay for Emily's tuition," she admitted. "Emily?" I repeated, stunned. "Your stepdaughter? You used my money to pay for her college?" "She needed it, Clarice," Margaret said defensively. "Her financial aid didn't come through, and she was at risk of losing her spot. What were we supposed to do, let her drop out?" "Yes!" I yelled, unable to hold back. "She's not my responsibility. That money was for me. How could you think this was okay?" Edward appeared in the doorway, holding his drink like it was a prop in some smug performance. "You're young," he said, echoing Margaret's favorite excuse. "You can always earn it back. Emily didn't have that kind of time." The room spun as their words sank in. Every sleepless night, every blistered hand from double shifts, every penny I'd pinched, it had all been for nothing. They'd taken what was mine and used it to bail out Emily, who, as far as I could tell, had never worked a day in her life. "I want it back," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Every cent." Edward snorted, taking a sip of his drink. "You're being dramatic, Clarice. It's already spent. What do you expect us to do, pull it out of thin air?" I don't care how you do it, I shot back. Figure it out. Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples like I was the unreasonable one. Clarice, please. You're acting like we robbed you. We're family. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made. Sacrifices? I snapped. I made sacrifices. I worked for that money. Emily didn't sacrifice anything. You stole it and handed it to her like it was yours to give. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed replaying the conversation in my head, my anger simmering hotter with every passing hour. By morning, I'd made up my mind. The first call I made was to Danny. I need help, I told her, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. Her outrage was immediate. They did what? Clarice, that's theft. You need to call a lawyer. The second call I made was to a law firm Danny recommended. The woman I spoke to listened patiently as I poured out the whole story, from Edward's manipulative charm to Margaret's dismissive excuses. This is a clear case of unauthorized use of funds, the lawyer said after a long pause. We can definitely pursue legal action, but it'll require some documentation on your part. Do you have access to the account statements? Yes, I said, my determination hardening. I'll send you everything. As I hung up, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't sure what would come next, but one thing was clear. I wasn't letting them get away with this. Edward and Margaret thought they could take advantage of me because I was young, because I was family, because they assumed I wouldn't fight back. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, emails, and an overwhelming mix of emotions. Danny sat with me one evening, helping me sort through old bank statements to gather evidence for the lawyer. I still can't believe they had the audacity to take it, she said, shaking her head as she highlighted the suspicious transfer. Like, who does that? And for Emily of all people. Doesn't she already get everything handed to her? I nodded, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from snapping the pen I was holding. She's never had to work for anything in her life, and now they're acting like I'm the selfish one for wanting my money back. Well, you're doing the right thing, Danny said firmly. They're counting on you feeling guilty, but you don't owe them anything. This was theft, plain and simple. The lawyer, Rebecca, agreed. During our first formal meeting, she reviewed the documents I'd brought and nodded approvingly. This is more than enough to support your case, she said. Since Edward transferred the money from your account without explicit permission, it qualifies as unauthorized use of funds. We'll start by sending a demand letter. I leaned forward in my chair. And if they ignore it? Then we escalate, she said simply. But trust me, most people respond when the legal system gets involved. They're likely panicking already. The thought of Edward and Margaret scrambling to cover their tracks gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. For years, they'd treated me like an afterthought, prioritizing Emily at every turn. Now, they'd finally have to face the consequences. The demand letter arrived at their house 3 days later. I imagined the scene. Edward opening the envelope, his smug smile fading as he read the contents. Margaret pacing the kitchen, wringing her hands and muttering about ungrateful children. Emily, oblivious as always, lounging in her dorm room with no idea what was happening. It didn't take long for the fallout to reach me. My phone buzzed late that evening, Edward's name flashing on the screen. I debated ignoring it, but decided to pick up, my curiosity winning out. "What the hell is this, Clarice?" he barked the moment I answered. "You sent a lawyer after us?" I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "I did. You stole my money, Edward. This is me holding you accountable." "Stole?" he repeated, his tone dripping with incredulity. "We're family. It was a loan." "No, it wasn't," I said sharply. "You didn't ask me. You didn't even tell me. You just took it." Margaret's voice cut in from the background. "Clarice, you're being ridiculous. We did this for Emily. She needed help." "And I didn't?" I shot back. "Do you have any idea how hard I worked for that money? How much I gave up to save it? You had no right." Edward scoffed. "You're young. You can earn it back. This is a waste of everyone's time." I guess we'll let the courts decide that, I said before hanging up. Their defiance only fueled my resolve. Rebecca filed the formal complaint the next day, citing unauthorized use of funds and breach of trust. This should get their attention, she said as she emailed me the court documents. If they refuse to repay the full amount, we'll move forward with legal proceedings. As word of the situation spread, I started hearing from extended family. Margaret had apparently told them I was being unreasonable, framing herself and Edward as selfless parents who'd made a tough decision for the good of the family. But I wasn't about to let their narrative go unchecked. During one particularly heated phone call, my aunt tried to intervene. "Clarice, you have to see it from their perspective," she said. "They were just trying to help Emily. Isn't that what family does?" "Family doesn't steal from each other," I replied coldly. "They could have asked me. They didn't. They just took what they wanted and assumed I wouldn't fight back." There was a long pause before she muttered, "Well, I suppose you have a point." Meanwhile, Danny became my lifeline. She stayed up late with me, going over Rebecca's updates and helping me stay focused. "I know it's exhausting," she said one night, as we sat in my living room, surrounded by paperwork. "But you're almost there. They're already cracking under the pressure." She wasn't wrong. Margaret had started sending me long, rambling texts, alternating between guilt-tripping and pleading for forgiveness. "We didn't mean to hurt you. Can't we just move on from this?" One message read. Another said, "Why are you dragging us through this? Emily's education is important. Don't you want her to succeed?" Edward, on the other hand, doubled down on his arrogance. When Rebecca contacted him for a statement, he refused to cooperate, insisting the money was family property and that I had no claim to it. "Let him dig his own grave," Rebecca said when I told her. "The courts don't look kindly on people who justify theft as a family matter." The breaking point came when Emily finally found out what was happening. She called me out of the blue, her tone more annoyed than apologetic. "Why are you making such a big deal about this?" she asked. "It's not like you needed the money right away." "Do you even hear yourself?" I snapped. "That money wasn't yours, it wasn't Edward's, it wasn't Margaret's, it was mine. And you're benefiting from something that was stolen from me." "Well, what do you want me to do about it?" she said, clearly exasperated. "Nothing," I replied. "I want them to do something about it. And trust me, they will." By the time the court date was set, Edward and Margaret were visibly unraveling. Rebecca had built a strong case, and with the mounting pressure of legal fees and the looming possibility of a formal judgment, they finally reached out to discuss a settlement. "We'll pay you back," Edward said begrudgingly during the mediation. "But this is ridiculous, Clarice. You're tearing the family apart over a misunderstanding." "No," I corrected him. "You tore this family apart the moment you decided my hard work didn't matter. This is me fixing it." The mediation room was stark and sterile, the kind of place that didn't allow for illusions. Edward sat across the table from me, arms crossed, his face a mask of frustration. Margaret sat beside him, wringing her hands and avoiding my gaze. Rebecca, my lawyer, sat confidently at my side, flipping through the stack of documents that outlined every detail of their betrayal. The mediator, a middle-aged woman with a calm but firm demeanor, began the session. "We're here to resolve the dispute between Clarice and Edward and Margaret Reynolds regarding the unauthorized transfer of $10,000 from Clarice's account. Both parties will have the opportunity to present their positions, and will work toward a settlement that satisfies both sides." "Let me start by saying this is a huge misunderstanding," Edward said, leaning forward. His tone was measured, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. "We didn't steal anything. We moved the money to help our other daughter Emily with her tuition. Clarice is young, she has plenty of time to save more." Rebecca didn't even flinch. "You transferred $10,000 out of her account without her permission," she said, her voice cutting through his excuses. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's theft." Edward smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's family money. We're all part of the same household. I didn't think we needed to ask for permission." You didn't think you needed to ask, Rebecca repeated, her tone incredulous. Even though the account was in Clarice's name and she was the sole contributor? Margaret finally spoke up, her voice shaky. We didn't mean to hurt her. We just thought... That she wouldn't notice? That she wouldn't care? I interrupted, my voice cold. You thought you could take what I worked for and call it a family decision. That's not how this works. The mediator raised a hand to stop the back and forth. Let's focus on the facts, she said, her tone firm. Clarice, your position is that the $10,000 was yours, earned through your work, and transferred without your consent. Is that correct? Yes, I said, holding my gaze steady. It was my money, saved over years of working multiple jobs. I didn't agree to any of this. And Edward, the mediator continued, you claim the transfer was made in good faith, with the intention of helping your other daughter? That's right, he said, his voice sharp. It wasn't malicious. We were just trying to help Emily. Then why didn't you ask me first? I shot back. Why did you lie and say it was going into a higher interest account? Edward opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, he looked genuinely cornered. Rebecca took over, sliding a document across the table. This is the transaction record showing the unauthorized transfer. It clearly states that Edward accessed the account without notifying Clarice. Additionally, we have screenshots of text messages where he admits to using the money for Emily's tuition. There's no ambiguity here. Margaret paled as the mediator examined the evidence. Edward's jaw tightened, his bravado fading. We didn't think it would be such a big deal, he muttered, almost to himself. It's a big deal, I said, my voice steady but firm. You didn't just take money. You took my trust. And now you're trying to justify it instead of owning up to what you did. The mediator set down the document and folded her hands. Edward, Margaret, based on the evidence presented, it's clear that the funds were transferred without Clarice's consent. While I understand your intentions, your actions violated her financial autonomy. The recommendation is for full repayment, along with any associated legal fees incurred by Clarice. Margaret gasped softly, but Edward didn't move, his face a mask of controlled fury. How are we supposed to come up with that kind of money? He asked, his voice tight. That's not my problem, I said coldly. Figure it out, just like I had to figure out how to save it in the first place. After a tense silence, the mediator spoke again. If you agree to the repayment, we can settle this here today. Otherwise, Clarice has the option to pursue a civil lawsuit, which could result in further financial penalties. Edward exhaled sharply, glaring at me like I was the one who had wronged him. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. We'll pay her back. The mediator nodded, sliding a settlement agreement across the table. Please review and sign. As they scrawled their signatures, Margaret looked up at me, her eyes filled with something between anger and sadness. We didn't mean for it to come to this, she said quietly. It didn't have to, I replied, meeting her gaze. You made the choice to take what wasn't yours. I'm just making sure you face the consequences. Walking out of that room, I felt a mix of emotions, relief, vindication, and a lingering sadness for what could never be repaired. Rebecca placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder as we headed to the elevator. You handled that perfectly, she said. They're lucky you didn't push for more. They'll pay for what they did, I said. That's all I wanted. But deep down, I knew it was about more than the money. It was about proving to myself that I wouldn't let anyone, not even my own family, treat me like I didn't matter. The check arrived in my account 2 weeks later, the first of several payments outlined in the settlement agreement. It wasn't the full $10,000 yet, but seeing even a fraction of my money returned felt like a victory. For the first time in weeks, I breathed a little easier. It wasn't just about the money, it was about knowing I had taken a stand. Margaret called the day after the transfer. Her voice was softer this time, almost apologetic. Clarice, she began, hesitating, we've started making the payments. I hope this means we can start moving on. I didn't respond immediately, choosing my words carefully. Moving on isn't just about paying me back, I said. It's about understanding what you did and why it was wrong. We didn't mean to hurt you, she said quickly. We were just trying to help Emily. You keep saying that, I replied, my tone even. But you didn't ask. You didn't even think about how it would affect me. That's what hurts the most. She sighed heavily, and for a moment I thought she might finally take responsibility. But then she said, You're young, Clarice. You have your whole life ahead of you to rebuild. Can't we just put this behind us? I clenched my jaw, feeling the familiar frustration bubbling up. This isn't about being young or old, Mom. It's about respect. And if you can't understand that, maybe we're not ready to move on. Her silence spoke volumes. Danny came over that evening with a bottle of wine to celebrate the first payment. To holding people accountable, she said, raising her glass with a grin. To never letting anyone take advantage of me again, I replied, clinking my glass against hers. As we talked, I realized just how much this experience had changed me. For years, I'd let Margaret and Edward's dismissive attitudes chip away at my confidence, convincing myself that standing up to them wasn't worth the fight. But now I knew better. Setting boundaries didn't make me selfish. It made me strong. A few weeks later, I got a message from Emily. It was brief and awkward, a half-hearted apology for her role in everything. I didn't know they were using your money. I'm sorry if I benefited from it, she wrote. I didn't bother replying. Whether she knew or not didn't change the fact that she had been complicit in a system that put her needs above mine. Forgiveness might come eventually, but not yet. Edward predictably stayed silent. He made the payments on time but didn't reach out, his pride likely keeping him from acknowledging the situation any further. That was fine by me. I wasn't interested in mending fences with someone who saw me as little more than a resource to exploit. As the payments continued to roll in, I started to feel like I could breathe again. I adjusted my budget, reopened my savings account, and set new goals for the future. The betrayal still stung, but it no longer consumed me. Instead, it fueled me, reminding me of my own resilience and the importance of protecting what I'd worked so hard to build. The money would eventually add up, but the sense of empowerment I'd gained from standing up for myself was priceless. Months later, as the final payment hit my account, I stared at the total balance with a mixture of pride and relief. My savings were whole again. Not just the money I'd worked so hard for, but the validation that came with reclaiming what was rightfully mine. It felt like a new chapter, one where I finally had control over my future. I treated myself to a quiet celebration that evening. No big parties, no extravagant purchases, just a simple toast in the comfort of my apartment. I'd rebuilt what they had tried to take from me, and the lessons I'd learned in the process were worth even more than the money. Margaret called again shortly after the final payment. This time, her tone was measured, almost careful. Clarice, she began, I know we've had our differences, but I hope we can move forward now. Moving forward means respecting me, I said, my voice calm but firm. Not just my money, but my decisions, my boundaries, my autonomy. If you can't do that, there's nothing to move forward to. There was a pause on her end, long enough for me to wonder if she'd finally heard me. I'll try, she said quietly. I really will. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a start. I didn't respond with forgiveness. It would take time to rebuild trust, but I felt a flicker of hope that maybe one day our relationship could be mended. For now, though, I was focused on myself. Danny and I sat on the balcony of my apartment a few weeks later, sipping wine as the sun set. She raised her glass and said, "So what's next for the amazing Clarice? Big plans?" I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. I'm not sure yet, I admitted. Maybe it's time to finally go back to school. Or maybe I'll invest in something I've always wanted. All I know is that whatever I do next, it'll be on my terms. To your terms, she said, clinking her glass against mine. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. Edward and Margaret had underestimated me. thinking I'd let their betrayal slide because of family ties. But I'd proven them wrong. I'd stood up for myself, reclaimed what was mine, and walked away stronger for it. The money in my account wasn't just a number. It was a symbol of my resilience, my independence, and my ability to fight for what I deserved. Whatever came next, I knew I was ready. And this time, no one would take it away from me.
You're unbelievable, Lena. You just had to mess everything up. Emily's voice cut through the sound of waves crashing in the distance. Her fork clattered onto her plate, and she crossed her arms dramatically, her glare fixed firmly on me. I sat there, frozen, as the other voices at the table went silent. The tension hung thick in the air, wrapping itself around the room like a suffocating blanket. My dad sighed heavily. My mom's lips tightened into that thin line she always made when she was trying not to take sides but clearly had already picked one. I stared down at my plate, the shrimp scampi suddenly tasteless, my appetite completely erased by the familiar weight of their judgment. My name is Lena Harper. I'm 35 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the one to blame. Family drama? My fault. Dinner running late? My fault. The weather turning bad on a picnic day? Well, if you asked my mom, she might find a way to pin that on me too. And the worst part? My sister, Emily, always seems to come out of these situations smelling like roses. Emily's always been the star. She's funny, charismatic, and great at making herself look like the victim when things don't go her way. My mom calls it charming. I call it exhausting. But it's the kind of exhausting you learn to live with when you've spent decades as the scapegoat in your own family. I should have seen this coming, the moment where Emily would pin another disaster on me. But somehow, I always hope for better. This particular disaster started 2 days ago when we arrived at the beach resort. It was supposed to be a relaxing family vacation. Time for me, Emily, and our parents to unwind together for a change. I'd even taken the lead on booking everything, the resort, the dinner reservations, and activities. I spent hours researching, comparing reviews, and triple-checking the confirmations to make sure everything was perfect. But when we showed up for our first dinner reservation at the resort's exclusive seafood restaurant, we were told there was no record of our booking. My mom immediately turned to me, her eyes narrowing. "Lena, I thought you said you handled this." "I did," I stammered, pulling up the confirmation email on my phone. "Look, it's right here. I made the reservation weeks ago." "Then why are we standing here with nowhere to sit?" Emily chimed in, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Great job, Lena." The hostess was apologetic but firm. The reservation had somehow been canceled, and the restaurant was fully booked for the night. We ended up eating burgers at a nearby casual diner, a far cry from the elegant seafood dinner we'd planned. And Emily made sure everyone knew just how upset she was. She kept sighing dramatically, shooting pointed looks in my direction, and muttering under her breath about how this was exactly why she hated letting other people handle things. The next morning wasn't much better. Emily had planned a snorkeling excursion for all of us, her one contribution to the trip. And when we arrived at the meeting point, the guide informed us that the boat had been delayed due to mechanical issues. It wasn't anyone's fault, but that didn't stop Emily from glancing my way and muttering, "Another flawless Lena plan." I wanted to scream. The snorkeling trip wasn't even my responsibility. But years of practice kept me silent. It wasn't worth starting a fight, I told myself. Better to let her vent and move on. But as the day went on, Emily's jabs became sharper, and my parents, true to form, did nothing to stop her. My mom even laughed at one of Emily's comments, saying, "You two need to work on your teamwork." Teamwork? As if this was some shared failure? I bit my tongue, feeling the familiar sting of tears threatening to form, but refusing to let them fall. And now here we were, sitting at a fancy restaurant on our second night. And Emily had decided to officially blame me for ruining the vacation. She leaned forward, her voice rising in pitch as she recounted every single mishap, twisting the narrative to make me look incompetent and careless. "First, we miss our dinner reservation because Lena can't manage to click the confirm button," she said, counting on her fingers for effect. "Then the snorkeling trip's a disaster because..." "What? Did you forget to check the weather or something?" "That's enough, Emily," I said quietly, my voice shaking. I could feel my dad's eyes on me, but he didn't speak up. My mom looked at me like she was waiting for me to apologize. Emily smirked, clearly enjoying the show. "Oh, come on," Emily continued, her tone syrupy sweet. "Don't get defensive. I'm just pointing out the facts. Someone has to." My fingers tightened around the edge of the tablecloth. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the anger bubbling up like a volcano I'd tried so hard to keep dormant. I'd spent my entire life letting things like this slide, convincing myself it wasn't worth the fight. But this time felt different. This time, I felt something snap. Emily's accusations hung in the air long after dinner ended. My dad leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples like the entire situation was a headache he couldn't wait to escape. My mom busied herself with the check, avoiding eye contact with me as if by doing so she wouldn't have to pick a side. "I don't understand why this has to be so complicated," my mom finally said, her voice heavy with exasperation. "Lena, you know how important these trips are for our family. Why didn't you double-check everything?" "I did," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. Everyone turned to look at me, surprised. "I checked everything, twice. The dinner, the snorkeling, all of it. I don't know how things went wrong, but it wasn't because I didn't try." Emily let out a dramatic sigh. Well, clearly, it wasn't enough. She pushed her chair back and stood up. "I'm going for a walk. Maybe someone else can figure out how to salvage what's left of this trip." She left without another word, leaving the rest of us sitting in awkward silence. My dad glanced at my mom, who shook her head as if to say, "Just drop it." That night, I lay awake in my hotel room, staring at the ceiling. The words Emily had thrown at me replayed in my mind like a broken record. "You just had to mess everything up. This is why we can't rely on you." It wasn't just her words that stung. It was the way my parents had let them hang there, unchallenged. My mom's thinly veiled criticism, my dad's passive silence. It was like they'd already decided I was guilty, even without proof. And why wouldn't they? This wasn't the first time Emily had turned the family against me, and it probably wouldn't be the last. I thought about calling my best friend Lisa. She'd been my sounding board for years, always quick to remind me that I wasn't as alone or as unimportant as my family sometimes made me feel. But it was late, and I didn't want to bother her. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my messages. As I stared at the screen, something caught my eye, a text thread from Emily dated 2 weeks ago. "Hey Lena, can you check the snorkeling thing for me? I'm slammed with work and might have messed something up. Actually, I think I accidentally canceled the dinner reservation too. Can you fix it?" My heart stopped. I scrolled further, rereading every message she'd sent. The more I read, the clearer it became. Emily had been the one to screw up the plans. She'd admitted it outright, then conveniently forgotten to mention it when she started blaming me. Under so much stress, I had forgotten about those messages. The next morning, I couldn't focus on anything. Breakfast was a blur of strained small talk, my mom trying to smooth things over with cheerful comments about the weather, while Emily scrolled on her phone, ignoring everyone. I kept glancing at my dad, hoping he'd say something, anything, to acknowledge what had happened the night before. But he stayed quiet, sipping his coffee like nothing was wrong. I excused myself as soon as I could, heading down to the beach to clear my head. I texted Lisa, asking if she had time for a quick call. She called back almost immediately. "What's up?" she asked, her voice warm and familiar. "You okay?" "Not really," I admitted, my voice breaking slightly. Emily's at it again. She blamed me for ruining the vacation, and my parents, they just went along with it. Like always. "Oh, for crying out loud," Lisa groaned. "What happened this time?" I told her everything. The dinner reservation, the snorkeling, the way Emily had twisted the story to make it seem like I was the problem. By the time I finished, I felt like I'd run a marathon. "And you're just letting her get away with it?" Lisa asked, her voice sharp. "Lena, you can't keep doing this. You have to stand up for yourself." "What's the point?" I said bitterly. "Even if I say something, they'll just take her side. They always do." "Not if you have proof," Lisa said. "Do you?" I hesitated, the screenshot thread flashing in my mind. Actually, I might. I told Lisa about the messages, reading them aloud to her as I scrolled. She listened silently, and when I finished, she let out a low whistle. "Lena, that's a smoking gun," she said. "You have to show them." "I don't know," I said, chewing my bottom lip. "It feels petty. Like, what if it just makes things worse?" "Worse than what? Letting Emily walk all over you while your parents do nothing? Come on, Lena. You've spent your whole life taking the blame for things that weren't your fault. Don't you think it's time to change that?" Her words hit me hard. Deep down, I knew she was right. But the thought of confronting Emily, and by extension my parents, made my stomach churn. What if they refused to believe me? What if it just reinforced their idea that I was the troublemaker? "Look," Lisa said gently, sensing my hesitation. "I know it's scary, but you deserve better than this. You deserve to have your side of the story heard." The rest of the day passed in a haze. My mom suggested a trip to the boardwalk, and my dad seemed eager to avoid any serious conversations. So I tagged along, pretending to enjoy myself while my mind raced. The screenshots burned a hole in my pocket, their presence both comforting and terrifying. By the time dinner rolled around, I'd made up my mind. I couldn't keep letting Emily rewrite the narrative. If she wanted to paint me as the villain, fine. But she'd have to do it in the face of the truth. The restaurant was stunning, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the ocean bathed in golden light. A soft melody played in the background, mingling with the clink of glasses and the hum of conversation. But at our table, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. I sat quietly, pushing a piece of salmon around my plate as my mom filled the silence with cheerful comments about how lovely the resort was. My dad nodded occasionally, his focus more on his wine glass than the conversation. Emily, as usual, was the center of attention, recounting some story about work that had both my parents chuckling. It was as if the chaos of the past 2 days had been completely forgotten, or maybe conveniently ignored. And then, just as dessert arrived, Emily turned to me with a smirk. "So, Lena, what's your plan for ruining tomorrow's itinerary? Or are we just winging it now?" My fork clattered onto my plate, the sound loud enough to draw a few glances from nearby tables. I felt my face flush, the anger bubbling up so quickly that I couldn't stop it. "That's enough, Emily," I said, my voice low but firm. She laughed, tilting her head as if she were amused. "Oh, come on. Don't get so defensive. I'm just joking." "No, you're not," I shot back, my hands trembling slightly as I pushed my plate aside. "You've been blaming me for everything that's gone wrong this week, and I'm done pretending it's okay." The table went silent. My mom's eyes widened, her hand halfway to her glass of water. My dad cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. Emily leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with a smug expression. "Here we go," she said, rolling her eyes. "Lena's playing the victim again." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "I'm not playing the victim. I'm just telling the truth. And since you seem to have trouble with that, let me help you out." I pulled my phone from my bag, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might drown out the sound of my own voice. I opened the text thread and placed the phone on the table, the screen facing up. "Do you recognize these, Emily?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. You sent me these 2 weeks ago, remember? Her smirk faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, reaching for the phone. What are you talking about? My mom leaned forward, squinting at the screen. What is this? It's the truth, I said, my voice steady now. Emily canceled the dinner reservation. She admitted it right here. I tapped the screen, scrolling up to highlight the messages. And the snorkeling trip? That wasn't my fault either. She asked me to fix her mistake, and when I couldn't, she decided to pin it on me instead. My dad's eyes narrowed as he reached for the phone, his face darkening as he read the messages. Emily, he said slowly, is this true? Emily's face turned red, and for a moment she looked genuinely panicked. But then, like clockwork, she put on the wide-eyed, innocent look she always used to get out of trouble. Dad, come on, she said, her voice trembling slightly. You know how easy it is to misinterpret texts. I wasn't blaming Lena. I was just venting. It was all a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? I repeated, my voice rising. You've been blaming me all week, calling me incompetent, making me feel like everything that's gone wrong is my fault. And now you're saying it's a misunderstanding? Girls, my mom said, holding up her hands. Let's not turn this into a fight. It's not a fight, I said, glaring at Emily. It's the truth. For once, I'm not letting her rewrite the story to make herself look good. Emily's smile wavered as she looked at my dad, her voice softening. I didn't mean to make things worse. I was stressed, okay? And I might have said things I shouldn't have, but that doesn't mean I don't care about this trip or our family. My dad set the phone down, his expression unreadable. He looked at me, then at Emily, and finally at my mom. Beth, he said quietly, I think we've been blind to how much we've been letting this happen. My mom's brow furrowed. What do you mean? I mean, my dad continued, Lena's been taking the blame for things she didn't do for years. We've let it slide because it was easier than dealing with the truth. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint clatter of dishes as a waiter cleared the table next to us. My mom opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Lena, she said finally, her voice soft. Why didn't you say anything sooner? I let out a bitter laugh. Would it have made a difference? Every time I've tried to defend myself, you've brushed it off or sided with Emily. Why would this time be any different? The weight of my words hung in the air, and for the first time in my life, I saw something crack in my mom's expression. Regret. Maybe even guilt. She reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on mine. I'm sorry, she said, and though the words felt small compared to the years of frustration I'd carried, they meant more than I expected. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting between our parents and me. Look, I didn't mean for this to happen, she said, her voice quieter now. I guess I messed up, okay? I'm sorry, Lena. I stared at her, unsure whether her apology was genuine or just another way to deflect attention. But for once, I didn't care. I wasn't seeking her approval. I'd already found what I needed. The truth, laid bare for everyone to see. The walk back to our hotel was unusually quiet. The sound of the waves crashing in the distance filled the silence as my family seemed lost in their own thoughts. My dad walked beside me, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, while my mom and Emily trailed a few steps behind, their hushed conversation barely audible. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. But that relief was mixed with exhaustion. Speaking up had drained me in ways I hadn't anticipated, and though I felt vindicated, part of me wondered what this would mean for us moving forward. Would anything really change? Or was this just another temporary moment of clarity, destined to fade like all the others? Back at the hotel, My dad motioned for me to join him on the balcony. The view was stunning, the moonlight casting a silver sheen over the ocean, but my mind was too cluttered to appreciate it. "Lena," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I owe you an apology." I turned to look at him, surprised. My dad wasn't the type to admit when he was wrong, not because he didn't care, but because he preferred to keep the peace by letting things blow over. Hearing those words felt like uncharted territory. "For what it's worth," he continued, "I think you were right at dinner. We've been unfair to you. I didn't see it at the time, but I see it now. And I'm sorry." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Thanks, Dad," I said quietly. "That means a lot." He rested a hand on my shoulder, giving it a small squeeze. "You've always been the steady one in this family, you know. We've leaned on you more than we should have. I can't promise we'll get it right overnight, but I'll try." Later that evening, my mom came to my room, her expression hesitant. She lingered in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. "I wanted to talk to you," she said, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "About tonight." I stayed silent, letting her gather her thoughts. She looked down at her hands, twisting a gold bracelet around her wrist. "Your dad's right," she said finally. "We haven't been fair to you. And I think deep down, I knew that. But it was easier to look the other way, especially when Emily made such a fuss about things." I let out a small, humorless laugh. "She's good at that." My mom smiled faintly, but didn't disagree. I want you to know that I see you, Lena. I see how much you've done for this family, how much you've sacrificed. And I'm sorry if it ever seemed like we didn't appreciate you." Her words, though overdue, brought a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. I nodded, my voice steady despite the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. "Thanks, Mom." Emily didn't say much the next morning. She was unusually quiet at breakfast, keeping her eyes on her plate and her comments to herself. But as we were packing up to leave, she approached me in the hallway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Hey," she said, her voice subdued. "About last night. I know I screwed up, and I'm sorry. I shouldn't have blamed you for everything." I studied her face, looking for the cracks in her usual armor. For once, she didn't seem defensive or smug, just tired. Maybe even a little ashamed. "It's not just about last night," I said carefully. "It's about a pattern, Emily. This keeps happening, and I'm not going to let it anymore." She nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I get it. I'll try to do better." It wasn't the sweeping apology I'd dreamed of, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The weeks after the vacation felt different. Subtle, but different. Emily sent me a few texts, small updates about her day or a funny meme, like she was testing the waters. My parents called more often too, asking about my work and genuinely listening when I talked about my projects. It wasn't a complete transformation. Old habits don't disappear overnight, but it felt like the start of something better. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the one holding everything together. They were meeting me halfway, and that was enough. But the biggest change wasn't in them, it was in me. Speaking up during that dinner had been terrifying, but it had also been freeing. I realized how much power I'd been giving them by staying silent, by letting myself carry the blame just to keep the peace. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to do it anymore. At work, the change was even more noticeable. I started saying no to tasks that weren't mine to take on, pushing back when my ideas were overlooked in meetings, and celebrating my wins instead of downplaying them. It was small things, really. Correcting a colleague when they misattributed my work or taking credit for a project I led. But those small things added up. My boss noticed. My team noticed. And eventually I noticed too. Lisa, of course, was my biggest cheerleader. Over lunch one day, she raised her glass of iced tea dramatically. "To the new Lena," she said, grinning. "A badass who doesn't take anyone's crap." I laughed, clinking my glass with hers. "I don't know about badass, but I'm getting there." "No, you're already there," she said firmly. "And it looks good on you." As for my family, things were still a work in progress. Emily and I weren't suddenly best friends, but we talked more often, and our conversations felt less fraught. My mom still had her moments, like when she asked me to help plan another family event. But this time, I set clear boundaries. "I'm happy to help," I told her, "but I'm not taking the lead on this. Let Emily handle it." She paused for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough," she said. And just like that, a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sunset, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The girl who had once bitten her tongue and let others dictate her story felt like a stranger now. I wasn't that person anymore. I was someone who spoke up, someone who set boundaries, someone who knew her worth. And the best part? I didn't need anyone else to validate that worth. Not Emily, not my parents, not anyone. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Not because everything had changed, but because I was the one who changed.
"You gave Alex the company?" I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady. "Without even telling me?" My father, seated behind his massive oak desk, didn't flinch. He flipped through a stack of papers, barely sparing me a glance. "He's the son, Sophia. It's his role to take over." The room seemed to close in around me. I gripped the back of the chair in front of me, trying to steady myself. "His role?" I echoed, my voice rising. "Papa, I've spent years preparing for this. I know the business inside and out. Alex he doesn't care about the company like I do." "Sophia," he said, his tone calm but final, "this isn't about caring. It's about tradition, and tradition says the son takes over. My name is Sophia Ramirez, and I'm 28 years old. For as long as I can remember, my father has been the most important figure in my life, stern but fair, as long as you stayed within the boundaries of his expectations. He built our family's import-export business from nothing, and I grew up watching him pour his heart and soul into making it a success. By the time I was 15, I knew I wanted to be a part of it. Not just a part, I wanted to lead it one day. I worked for that dream tirelessly. I graduated with honors, earned a degree in finance, and spent countless hours shadowing my father at work. I took on internships that gave me hands-on experience in logistics and operations, and I even started proposing changes to improve efficiency. My father always nodded approvingly at my ideas, saying things like, "You're sharp, Sophia. You'd make a great CFO one day." The CFO line stung every time. It was a compliment, sure, but it was also a boundary. No matter how hard I worked, how much I knew, or how passionate I was, he never once said, "You'd make a great CEO," because that role was reserved for Alex, my younger brother. Alex and I couldn't be more different. Where I was driven and disciplined, Alex was charming but lazy. He breezed through school with mediocre grades, more interested in soccer practice and late-night parties than studying. When he joined the family business, he treated it like a side gig, a fallback option in case his real dreams didn't pan out. He'd come in late, leave early, and spend most of his time scrolling through his phone or chatting with friends in the office. Despite this, my father adored him. "He just needs time to grow into his role," he'd say whenever I pointed out Alex's lack of effort. "He's still young." It was infuriating, but I kept telling myself that my work would speak for itself. That one day my father would see what I was capable of and reconsider. But now, standing in his office, hearing him dismiss me with the wave of a hand, I realized I'd been fooling myself. The announcement of Alex's promotion spread quickly through the company. My colleagues, who had come to respect my work over the years, offered me awkward smiles and whispered words of sympathy. Even the employees who liked Alex looked uneasy, It was clear to everyone that he wasn't ready for this responsibility. I tried to focus on my current projects, but the frustration and resentment gnawed at me. Every time Alex made a mistake or brushed off a meeting, I felt my blood boil. He didn't even seem to care about the company's success. He was just going through the motions, secure in the knowledge that the role had been handed to him on a silver platter. It all came to a head one afternoon when I overheard a heated conversation between Alex and one of our senior managers. I was walking past the conference room when I heard raised voices. "Alex, this shipment delay is going to cost us thousands," the manager said, his tone exasperated. "We need to address this now." "I'm working on it," Alex replied, his voice defensive. "It's not that big of a deal." "Not that big of a deal?" the manager shot back. "Do you even understand the implications? We're going to lose a major client if this isn't resolved." I peeked inside to see Alex slouched in his chair, avoiding the manager's gaze. My heart sank. This wasn't just about tradition or favoritism anymore. Alex's inexperience and lack of commitment were putting the entire company at risk. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, my laptop open in front of me. I'd pulled up the company's financial reports, client contracts, and logistics records, trying to get a clearer picture of the situation. The deeper I dug, the worse it looked. Delays, lost accounts, oversights. Alex was driving the company into the ground, and my father was too blinded by tradition to see it. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. The thought of confronting my father again filled me with dread, but I knew I couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the future of the business, the people who worked there, and the legacy my father had built. Taking a deep breath, I picked up my phone and called Elena, my former professor and closest confidant. "I need your advice," I said when she answered. "I think I'm about to start a fight I can't win." "Good," she said without missing a beat. "That means it's worth fighting for." The business's struggles became impossible to ignore. Within weeks of Alex taking over, delayed shipments and missed deadlines had started piling up. The company's once pristine reputation was now being whispered about in industry circles, and loyal clients were quietly exploring other options. My father, ever the optimist where Alex was concerned, continued to excuse his mistakes. "He's learning, Sophia," my father said one evening at dinner, his tone dismissive. "These things take time." "How much time, Papa?" I shot back, unable to keep the frustration out of my voice. "Do you even realize how many accounts we've lost this month? Or how close we are to losing one of our biggest clients?" Alex, seated across from me, rolled his eyes. "Relax, Sophia. I've got it under control." My hands tightened around my fork. "Under control? Like the shipment to Valencia last week? Or the contract renewal you forgot to send?" Okay, my father interjected, his voice stern. "That's enough. We're not going to fix this over dinner." I bit my tongue, pushing back the words I wanted to say. The tension at the table was suffocating, but my father's stubbornness was worse. He wouldn't listen. Not yet. That night, I called Elena. She picked up on the second ring, her no-nonsense tone instantly calming me. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Worse than I thought," I admitted, pacing the length of my living room. "Alex is completely in over his head, and my father refuses to see it. He's too blinded by this whole tradition nonsense to realize the business is falling apart." "And what are you going to do about it?" Elena asked, her question sharp and direct. I paused, the words catching in my throat. "I don't know. What can I do? My father's made it clear he doesn't think I belong in the top seat. Even if I confront him, he'll just dismiss me again." Elena sighed. "Sophia, you're the most capable person I know. You've spent years preparing for this, and you're going to let a little stubbornness stop you?" "It's not little," I said bitterly. "It's decades of it." "So prove him wrong," she said simply. "Don't wait for him to hand you the reins. Show him why you're the one who should be running the company." Her words stayed with me long after we ended the call. Prove him wrong. It sounded simple enough, but the thought of taking on my father, of challenging everything he believed, felt like an impossible mountain to climb. The next week at work, things hit a breaking point. I was in the office, finalizing a report, when one of the sales managers, Carlos, knocked on my door. "Sophia," he said, stepping inside, "can I talk to you for a minute?" I nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "What's going on?" "It's Alex," he said, his voice low. "He's struggling. He missed another client meeting this morning, and when I tried to follow up, he said it wasn't a big deal. But it is a big deal, Sophia. That client is one of our biggest accounts." I closed my laptop, leaning forward. "Does Papa know?" Carlos hesitated. "I tried to bring it up last week, but he brushed it off. I think he's hoping Alex will just figure it out." I sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "Thank you for telling me, Carlos. I'll handle it." After he left, I sat in silence, staring at the reports on my desk. I couldn't sit by and watch the company crumble. If my father wouldn't listen to reason, I'd have to make him. Over the next few days, I threw myself into preparing. I combed through every aspect of the company, financial reports, client feedback, operational bottlenecks, and built a comprehensive plan to address the issues. It wasn't just about pointing out Alex's failures. It was about showing a clear path forward, one that I was uniquely qualified to lead. Elena reviewed my plan during one of our late-night calls. "This is solid, Sophia," she said, her tone impressed. "You've covered every angle." "Thanks," I said, though my stomach still churned with nerves. "But will it be enough? You know how my father is." "Forget about what he'll say," Elena said firmly. "This isn't just about him. It's about the company, the people who work there, and the future you want to build. Go in there and own it." With my plan finalized, I decided to call a family meeting. If I was going to confront my father, I wanted Alex there too. He needed to hear this just as much as my father did. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. My mind raced with every possible outcome. My father dismissing me again, Alex lashing out, the plan falling apart. But deep down, I knew I didn't have a choice. If I didn't act now, the company might not survive. As I walked into the dining room the next evening, my heart pounded in my chest. My father and Alex were already seated, their expressions a mix of curiosity and impatience. I took a deep breath, clutching the folder in my hands. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice steady despite the nerves coursing through me. "I need to talk to you both about the company, and I need you to listen." The dining room felt more like a battlefield than a family space that evening. My father sat at the head of the table, as he always did, his expression stoic. Alex slouched in his chair, scrolling through his phone until my father shot him a sharp look. I stood at the other end, clutching the folder of documents that contained my plan, feeling a mix of nerves and determination. "Well, Sophia," my father said, breaking the silence. "You called this meeting. Let's hear it." I took a deep breath and opened the folder. "I've been reviewing the company's performance over the past few months," I began, my voice steady. "And it's clear that we're heading toward a crisis. Shipments are delayed, clients are leaving, and our reputation is suffering. If we don't take immediate action, we could lose everything." My father's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. Alex, however, let out a derisive laugh. "Come on, Sophia, it's not that bad. You're blowing this out of proportion." I turned to him, my gaze unwavering. "Alex, we've lost 3 major clients in the last month. One of them had been with us for over a decade. Does that sound like nothing to you?" His smirk faltered, but he didn't respond. I placed a report in front of my father, pointing to the highlighted sections. "This is the financial impact of those losses. And this," I said, pulling out another document, "is the feedback from clients who've left. They all say the same thing: poor communication, missed deadlines, and lack of leadership." My father's face darkened as he read through the reports. "Why haven't I seen these before?" he asked, his voice tight. Because no one wants to upset you, I said, meeting his gaze. Everyone is afraid to tell you the truth, Papa. But I'm not. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. And what is this truth, Sophia? That Alex isn't ready for this role, I said bluntly. And if we keep pretending he is, we'll lose the business. Alex shot up from his chair, his face red. This is ridiculous. You've always been jealous because I'm the one in charge and you're not. Just admit it, Sophia. Jealous? I said, my voice rising. You think I want to be in charge so I can stroke my ego? This isn't about me, Alex. It's about the company. It's about the employees who rely on us for their livelihoods. It's about preserving what Papa spent his whole life building. Alex fell silent, his hands clenched at his sides. My father watched us both, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought I'd gone too far, but I pressed on. I'm not saying this to hurt you, Alex, I said, softening my tone. But you know as well as I do that you're not ready for this, and that's okay. No one's blaming you for that. But if we don't act now, it'll be too late. I turned back to my father, sliding a folder across the table. This is my plan, I said. It addresses the problems we're facing, improving communication with clients, streamlining operations, and regaining the trust we've lost. I've mapped out the steps we need to take and how we can implement them immediately. He opened the folder, flipping through the pages in silence. I could see the tension in his jaw, the conflict playing out in his mind. When he finally looked up, his eyes were tired but sharp. This is a good plan, he admitted. But leadership isn't just about plans, Sophia. It's about responsibility. And I've been responsible my entire life, I said, my voice steady. You know that. You've seen how much I care about this business, how hard I've worked. I've earned this, Papa. All I'm asking for is a chance to prove it. The room was silent for what felt like an eternity. My father stared at me, his gaze heavy with the weight of decades of tradition and expectations. Finally, he turned to Alex. What do you think? He asked. Alex looked stunned. What do I think? You're seriously considering this? I am, my father said quietly. Because Sophia's right. This business can't survive if we keep going the way we are. Alex opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. He sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping. Fine, he muttered. Let her do it. My father turned back to me, his expression solemn. You'll have your chance, Sophia, he said. But understand this, it won't be easy. You'll need to prove yourself every step of the way. I nodded, my heart pounding. I understand, Papa, and I won't let you down. That night, as I left the dining room, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, pride, and a lingering sense of uncertainty. I'd won the battle, but the war was far from over. The real work was just beginning. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Stepping into a leadership role meant long hours, tough decisions, and constantly proving myself, not just to my father, but to the entire company. My first order of business was meeting with the department heads to address the chaos Alex had left behind. They were wary at first, their skepticism evident in the way they hesitated to speak freely. But as I listened to their concerns and implemented quick, effective solutions, the mood began to shift. Slowly but surely, trust was being rebuilt. At home, things were more complicated. My father's demeanor was a mixture of pride and unease. He had spent his whole life believing that leadership was a man's role, and while he was starting to see the truth, old habits didn't die easily. One evening I found him sitting in his study, staring at a photo of the family from years ago. "You've done well, Sophia," he said, not looking up. The words caught me off guard. "Thank you, Papa," I said softly. He set the photo down and met my gaze. "I should have seen it sooner. You're more than capable. I've always known that. But it's hard to change how you've seen the world your whole life." I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "It's not just about you changing, Papa. It's about what's best for the company and for our family." He gave a small, reluctant smile. "I see that now?" Alex, on the other hand, was a different story. For the first few days after I took over, he barely showed his face around the office. When I finally cornered him in the break room, he looked uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes as he grabbed his coffee. "You don't have to hide, Alex," I said gently. "This isn't about you failing. It's about putting the company first." He sighed, leaning against the counter. I feel like I let everyone down, especially Dad." "You didn't let anyone down," I said. "You were put in a position you weren't ready for. That's not your fault." He looked at me, his expression softening. "You really mean that?" "Of course I do. You have so many strengths, Alex. Leadership just isn't one of them, and that's okay. It doesn't make you any less valuable." For the first time in years, we talked openly about the pressure he'd felt, the mistakes he'd made, and the weight of expectations. By the end of the conversation, I could tell he felt lighter, even if he wasn't quite ready to admit it. As the weeks turned into months, the company began to stabilize. We regained 2 major clients and implemented new systems to prevent the kind of mismanagement that had caused the earlier chaos. My father started attending fewer meetings, trusting me to handle the day-to-day operations. Even Alex found his place, taking on a role in marketing where his creativity and charisma could shine without the burden of leadership. At night, as I sat in my office reviewing the day's work, I often felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The journey had been anything but easy, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. 6 months later, the business was unrecognizable, in the best way. Systems were running smoothly, client relationships were stronger than ever, and the morale among employees had visibly improved. I'd worked hard to rebuild the trust that had been fractured, and the results were starting to show. Every success, big or small, felt like a validation, not just of my leadership, but of my worth. For the first time, I felt truly confident in my role. The doubt that had haunted me for years, the feeling that I needed to prove myself, was fading. I knew I belonged here. Every decision I made, every problem I solved, solidified that belief. It wasn't about pleasing my father or outshining Alex anymore. It was about doing what I loved and doing it well. My father had changed too. He no longer hovered over my decisions or questioned my judgment. Instead, he asked for updates with genuine curiosity and offered advice only when I sought it out. One afternoon, he stopped by my office, a rare visit these days. "I was going through the old client records," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "You brought back a client we lost 5 years ago. I couldn't do that, but you did." I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't expected. "Thanks, Papa. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was worth it." He nodded, his expression softening. "I'm proud of you, Sophia. You've done more for this company than I ever could have imagined." Hearing those words from him, after everything we'd been through, was more satisfying than I could have hoped. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about his respect, something I'd spent my whole life chasing. Alex was thriving too, in his own way. He'd embraced his role in marketing, using his creativity and natural charm to bring fresh ideas to the company. He even started pitching new campaigns to me during our meetings, and while we didn't always agree, there was a new sense of collaboration between us. For the first time, we weren't competing. We were working together. At home, things felt lighter. Family dinners were no longer filled with tension, and my father had started asking about my ideas and plans, listening in a way he never had before. Even my mother, who had always stayed quiet during these debates, began chiming in with encouragement and praise. One evening, as I walked through the office after hours, I stopped by the conference room and looked out at the view of the city lights. This was my company now. Not because it had been handed to me, but because I'd earned it. I thought about the girl I'd been 6 months ago, angry, overlooked, and unsure of her place. That girl was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more confident, and unafraid to fight for what she deserved. This was just the beginning. There were more challenges ahead, more mountains to climb, but I knew I could face them. The company was thriving, my family was healing, and I was finally living the life I'd always envisioned, not by chance, but by choice. As I turned off the lights and locked the office for the night, I felt a deep sense of peace. This wasn't just my victory, it was my future, and I couldn't wait to see what came next. "You're funding Adam's company again?" My voice cracked as I stared across the dining table at my father. "Dad, his last 2 ventures burned through tens of thousands of your money. I'm pitching you an actual plan, something viable, and you won't even consider it?" My father, Omar Hassan, didn't even blink. He folded his napkin neatly, leaning back in his chair as if I hadn't just poured weeks of effort into the proposal sitting in front of him. "Layla, I admire your enthusiasm, but business is a man's responsibility. Adam needs this to establish himself. You have a stable job. You should focus on that." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. My brother Adam was staring at his phone, barely paying attention. He didn't even move at my father's dismissive tone. Why would he? He'd heard it before, always directed at me. "My name is Layla Hassan, and I'm 30 years old. For as long as I can remember, I've wanted to start my own business. I've always been the ambitious one, the planner, the one who researched ideas late into the night and woke up with new ones buzzing in my head. It wasn't just a dream, it was my calling. Growing up, I'd watched my father build his own business from scratch, a logistics company that became the backbone of our family's stability. I admired his work ethic and his tenacity, but most of all, I admired the way he made something out of nothing. I wanted to follow in his footsteps, but it was clear early on that he didn't see me as a successor. For him, Adam was the heir apparent. Despite my older brother's lack of drive, my father saw him as the natural choice. Adam had tried and failed at several ventures by now, an e-commerce site, a failed app, and a short-lived marketing agency. Each time my father had written the checks and made excuses for his failures. "Adam just needs to find his footing," he'd say. "It's all part of the process." But when it came to me, there were no excuses, no second chances. My entrepreneurial aspirations were brushed aside as impractical or unimportant. "You're better off staying in your job," he'd tell me. "It's secure, and you're good at it." He wasn't wrong. I was good at my job. I'd worked my way up to a mid-level role in finance, managing complex budgets and analyzing market trends. But it wasn't enough. I wanted something of my own, something I could build and nurture. And now, staring at my father's calm, unyielding face, I realized he'd never see that in me. "Dad, this is a mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're giving Adam another shot at something he's not ready for. Meanwhile, I've spent months developing this plan. It's low risk and scalable. You could have returns within the first year." My father shook his head. "Layla, it's not about risk. It's about opportunity. Adam needs this." "And I don't?" I snapped, the frustration boiling over. "Why does he deserve a chance, but I don't? Is it because I'm not good enough or because I'm not—" "Enough," my father interrupted, his tone sharp. "This discussion is over." I stood there for a moment, my chest tight and my hands trembling. Then I pushed back my chair and left the table without another word. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment, staring at the proposal I'd spent weeks perfecting. It wasn't just a plan, it was a piece of me. I'd envisioned a boutique consultancy that offered financial planning and strategy for small businesses, combining my passion for numbers with my desire to help others succeed. I'd identified a niche market, created detailed projections, and even mapped out a marketing strategy. And my father had dismissed it without a second glance. I wanted to cry, but instead I opened my laptop. If my father wouldn't back me, I'd figure out another way. I didn't have his resources, but I had my skills, my determination, and my savings. It wasn't much. barely enough to cover the basics, but it was a start. I wasn't going to let his doubts stop me. The next morning, I called Yasmin, my best friend and the only person who'd supported my entrepreneurial dreams from the beginning. "I'm going to do it," I told her, my voice shaky but resolute. "I'm starting the business." "Yes," she exclaimed, her enthusiasm like a balm for my battered confidence. "I'm so proud of you, Layla. You're going to crush this." "I don't know about crushing it," I said with a weak laugh. "But I'm going to try. I can't let him win. I can't let him be right about me." "He's not right about you," Yasmin said firmly. "He's stuck in the past. This isn't about proving him wrong. It's about proving yourself right." Her words stayed with me all day. I didn't need my father's approval to succeed. I just needed to believe in myself. Starting the business was harder than I expected, and I already knew it wouldn't be easy. I drained most of my savings on registration fees, a basic website, and the cheapest laptop that could run the accounting software I needed. My dining table became my office, and every spare minute outside my day job went into building the foundation of my company. My first hurdle was finding clients. I scoured online forums, cold emailed small businesses, and even went door to door in local shopping districts, handing out flyers I'd designed myself. Most of the time, people were polite but non-committal. "We'll think about it," they'd say, or "maybe next quarter." I tried not to let the rejections get to me, but it was hard not to feel like I was in over my head. At night, I'd lie in bed replaying my father's words. "Focus on your stable job." Some nights, I almost believed he was right. "Layla, you need to stop beating yourself up," Yasmin said one evening as we sat in my apartment, brainstorming ways to get my name out there. "This is how it goes at the start. You're planting seeds. They'll grow. You just need to give it time." Yasmin had become my biggest cheerleader and unofficial business partner. She worked as a graphic designer, and when I told her about my idea, she immediately offered to help with branding. She designed a logo, spruced up my website, and created sleek, professional-looking brochures that made my little operation feel more legitimate. "I don't know what I'd do without you," I said, watching her tweak a design on her tablet. "You'd figure it out," she replied with a smile. "But lucky for you, you don't have to." With her help, I revamped my marketing approach. Instead of casting a wide net, I focused on businesses in my community, boutiques, cafes, and other small operations that were struggling to stay afloat. I offered free consultations to get my foot in the door, and though it meant more work with no immediate payoff, it started to pay dividends. One client led to another, and soon I had a small but steady stream of business. Meanwhile, my family's skepticism hung over me like a dark cloud. My father hadn't said much since I'd walked out of that dinner, but his silence was its own kind of judgment. My mother called occasionally to check in, though it was clear she was fishing for updates. "How's your little project going?" she'd ask, her tone kind but patronizing. "It's not a project, Mama," I'd say, forcing a smile. "It's a business. And it's going well." "Good, good," she'd reply quickly, as if eager to move on. "You know, your father is very busy with Adam's company right now. Maybe you should ask Adam for advice." The mention of Adam made my stomach turn. His startup, buoyed by my father's funding, was floundering. I knew because I still had connections in the industry, and word had gotten around that Adam was struggling to keep his investors happy. Yet my father continued to throw money at him, insisting he just needed more time. One afternoon, I ran into Adam at a coffee shop near my apartment. He was sitting at a table, typing furiously on his laptop, his face a mask of frustration. "Hey," I said, approaching cautiously. "How's it going?" He looked up, startled. "Layla, what are you doing here?" "I live around the corner," I said, gesturing toward the window. "How's the company?" He hesitated, his eyes darting back to his screen. "It's fine. Just a lot of moving parts, you know?" "Right," I said, not pressing further. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Adam was in way over his head. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Back at home, I threw myself into refining my strategy. I started tracking every detail of my business, analyzing what worked and what didn't. I tightened my budget, streamlined my processes, and set ambitious but achievable goals. Every small victory felt monumental. The first client to recommend me to someone else. The first month I made enough profit to cover my rent. Each step forward proved to me that I was capable, even if my father couldn't see it. One evening, Yasmin and I celebrated my first big milestone, landing a contract with a local chain of bakeries to manage their finances and payroll. "This is it, Layla," she said, clinking her soda can against mine. "This is your breakthrough." "It's a start," I said with a smile, though my heart swelled with pride. For the first time, I felt like I was gaining real momentum. Despite the progress, setbacks still came. A potential client ghosted me after weeks of negotiations. Another dropped my services after deciding to hire an in-house team. Each time, I felt the sting of rejection, but I refused to let it derail me. Instead, I leaned on Yasmin and reminded myself why I'd started this journey in the first place. "I'm not doing this to prove my father wrong," I said during one of our late-night planning sessions. "At least, not entirely. I'm doing this because I believe in it. I believe in me. And that," Yasmin said, pointing at me with her pen, "is why you're going to make it." The turning point came 6 months after I launched my business. The bakery chain I'd landed as a client started recommending me to their suppliers, and suddenly, my inbox was flooded with inquiries. Within weeks, I was managing financial planning and payroll for 5 small businesses, and I'd hired Yasmin part-time to help with branding and communications. The growth was exhilarating. For the first time, I could afford to move my office from my dining table to a co-working space downtown. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like a milestone, a tangible sign of how far I'd come. Every time I walked into that space, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and buzz of creativity, I felt proud. I built this, I'd remind myself. I made this happen. Meanwhile, the cracks in Adam's startup were becoming impossible to ignore. Rumors swirled about missed deadlines, unhappy investors, and internal chaos. My mother's calls became more frequent, her concern for Adam seeping into every conversation. "He's under so much pressure," she'd say, her voice heavy with worry. "Your father's doing everything he can to help him, but I don't know if it'll be enough." The collapse came fast. One morning, while I was meeting with a new client, my phone buzzed with a series of messages from a friend in the industry. "Have you heard? Adam's company is shutting down. Investors pulled out. Total mess. Your dad must be furious." By the time I got home that evening, the news had reached my parents. My mother called me, her voice a mixture of panic and resignation. "Layla, can you come over for dinner tonight? Your father wants to talk to you." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to decline, to avoid the inevitable drama, but a bigger part of me wanted to face them, to show my father that while Adam's venture had failed, I was thriving. When I arrived, the tension in the house was palpable. My father sat at the head of the table, his face lined with stress. My mother hovered nearby, setting plates on the table even though no one looked interested in eating. Adam was slouched in a chair, staring at his phone. "Layla," my father said as I took my seat, "we need to talk." I braced myself, expecting a lecture about family loyalty or an appeal to help Adam pick up the pieces. Instead, he surprised me. "I've been hearing about your business," he said, his tone measured. "You've built something impressive." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I'd waited so long to hear those words from him that I didn't know how to respond. "Thank you," I said finally, keeping my voice steady. "It hasn't been easy, but it's worth it." He nodded, his eyes flicking to Adam, who was still scrolling through his phone. Adam's company didn't work out. I thought I was helping him by giving him what he needed, but I see now that I wasn't helping either of you. I stared at him, hardly believing what I was hearing. "What do you mean?" "I underestimated you," he admitted, his gaze meeting mine. "I thought Adam needed my support more than you did. I was wrong. You've proven that." Adam finally looked up, his face a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. "Dad, this isn't about her," he said, his voice defensive. "My company didn't fail because of me. The investors—" "Enough, Adam," my father said sharply. "You're not a failure, but you weren't ready. Layla was." The room fell silent. I could see the weight of my father's words settling on Adam, and though part of me wanted to feel vindicated, I also felt a pang of empathy. I knew what it was like to feel dismissed, to struggle to prove yourself. The difference was I'd turned that struggle into fuel. "Layla," my father continued, his voice softer now, "I'm proud of you. I should have told you that sooner. You've shown me what it means to fight for something you believe in. I see that now." For years, I'd imagined this moment, my father finally acknowledging my worth, apologizing for overlooking me. I thought it would feel triumphant, like winning a long and brutal battle. But in that moment, I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt something deeper. Peace. "Thank you, Dad," I said, my voice steady. "I didn't do this to prove you wrong. I did it because I knew I could. And I hope now you can see that too." He nodded, his expression heavy with a mix of regret and pride. "I do," he said simply. That evening, as I left my parents' house, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. My father's words couldn't undo the years of doubt, but they were a start. More importantly, they weren't the validation I needed anymore. I'd found that on my own. The weeks following that dinner were quieter than I expected. My father didn't bring up Adam's failed startup again, but the tension between them seemed to ease. Adam still carried the weight of disappointment, but he began asking me questions about my business, questions I never imagined he'd ask. One evening, he called me out of the blue. "Layla," he started, sounding hesitant, "how do you manage your client relationships? Like, what keeps them coming back?" I almost dropped my phone. "Are you asking for advice?" "Yeah," he admitted. "I mean, clearly you're doing something right. I don't want to make the same mistakes again." For a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to bask in the irony, my brother, the golden child, asking me for guidance. But I could hear the sincerity in his voice, and it reminded me of how much I'd wanted that same validation not long ago. "It's about trust," I said finally. "You can have the best product or service in the world, but if your clients don't trust you to deliver, none of it matters. You have to show them you're invested in their success." "Huh," Adam said thoughtfully. "That makes sense. Thanks, Layla." The call ended, but it stayed with me. Adam's humility, though tentative, was a sign of growth I hadn't expected. My father, too, began to change. He stopped referring to my business as a project and started asking real questions about my clients, my strategies, and my long-term goals. He even offered to connect me with a few of his old contacts, though I politely declined. I wasn't ready to mix family and business again, not yet. Still, his support meant something. One afternoon, he visited my office for the first time. It was a modest co-working space, nothing like the sprawling headquarters he used to run, but he seemed genuinely impressed. "You've built something remarkable here," he said, looking around. "I'm proud of you, Layla." I smiled, the words warming a part of me I hadn't realized was still tender. "Thank you, Dad. That means a lot." But the biggest change was within me. For years, I'd tied my worth to my father's approval, waiting for him to see me as capable. Now, I realized I didn't need his validation, or anyone else's. My confidence came from knowing what I'd accomplished, from the risks I'd taken and the lessons I'd learned along the way. Running a business wasn't just about profit margins or client retention. It was about resilience, creativity, and believing in yourself even when no one else does. And I'd proven to myself that I could do it. One evening, as I sat in my office wrapping up for the day, I looked out at the city lights and thought about how far I'd come. My family dynamics were shifting, slowly but surely. My father and brother were learning to see me not as the underestimated daughter or sibling, but as someone who could stand on her own. And more importantly, I was learning to see myself that way too. The journey wasn't over. I still had goals to achieve, clients to win, and challenges to overcome. But for the first time, I felt truly independent, truly capable. This was my life, and I was living it on my own terms. 6 months later, my business had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. What started as a one-woman operation at my dining table had become a small but thriving consultancy. I'd hired 2 part-time employees to help manage the workload, and Yasmin had officially joined as my creative director. Together, we were helping small businesses turn their finances around, one spreadsheet and strategy at a time. One of my proudest moments came when a regional business magazine featured me in an article about emerging entrepreneurs. They called my company a shining example of grassroots success, and when the article was published, I sent a copy to my parents. My mother called immediately, her voice brimming with pride. "Layla, this is incredible. Your father's already framed it for his office." The thought of my father proudly displaying an article about my business was almost surreal. For years, I'd wanted nothing more than for him to see me this way, as someone capable and deserving of his respect. And now I'd earned that respect not because he handed it to me, but because I proved it to myself. At family dinners, things felt different. My father asked thoughtful questions about my work, genuinely interested in my answers. Adam, too, seemed to have turned a corner. He'd started working for a marketing firm, finally finding his footing in a structured environment where his creativity could shine. There was no longer an air of competition between us, only mutual respect. "Layla," Adam said one evening as we cleared the table, "you're doing something amazing. I'm proud of you." "Thanks, Adam," I replied, the sincerity of his words settling warmly in my chest. "That means a lot." He grinned. "But don't think I won't steal some of your ideas for my next project." "Only if you pay me consulting fees," I shot back, laughing. The biggest change, though, was within me. Running my business had taught me more than just the mechanics of entrepreneurship. It had shown me the power of perseverance and self-belief. I no longer doubted my place at the table or felt the need to justify my ambitions. I was living proof that success wasn't about who got the first chance. It was about who made the most of it. One afternoon, I stood in my office looking out at the bustling street below. My father's voice echoed in my mind, not the dismissive tone from that dinner months ago, but the proud words he'd spoken more recently. "You've built something remarkable." For so long, I'd waited for his approval, but now I realized it wasn't what defined me. I defined me. As I locked up the office and headed home, I felt a deep sense of peace. My business was thriving, my family relationships were healing, and I was finally living a life that felt authentically mine. The road hadn't been easy, but every struggle had shaped me into the leader I was becoming. This wasn't just the end of one chapter, it was the start of something even bigger. My future was in my hands, and I couldn't wait to see where it would take me.